Welcome back to my channel. Hey there. Tonight's story isn't about victory or glory, it's about consequences, divine ones. The kind of punishments only the gods of Olympus could dream up. You'll wander through old myths and whisper-read warnings, hearing tales of mortals and demigods who pushed their luck a little too far. A liar here, a thief there, and always somewhere in the clouds, a god watching with lightning in one hand and a long memory in the other. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same quiet stories. So breathe deep, let the world grow quiet and follow the trail of Punish, myth, marble, and thunder. You've tucked yourself in. The room is quiet. The world for a little while is no longer demanding your attention. Now, let's drift back, not just in time, but beyond time, into the world of Greek mythology, a place where gods argued like relatives at a wedding. Mortals made poor choice with remarkable consistency, and punishment was rarely proportionate or merciful or sensible, if we're being honest. Tonight's journey begins not with the punishment itself, but with the divine mind behind it. Because to understand why the gods punished, we must first understand who they were and what on earth made them so terribly moody. The Greek gods were a spectacular blend of brilliance and pettiness. Unlike the all-knowing, all-loving deities of later religions, the Olympians were very human. They argued, they cheated, they got jealous, threw tantrums, and played favorites. They could bless you with beauty one day and turn you into a lizard the next. Their sense of justice had less to do with morality and more to do with mood. Zeus, for instance, the king of the gods, was known for his thunderbolts and, shall we say, a rather vigorous romantic life. He ruled Olympus with a heavy hand and an even heavier ego, whelped any mortal or titan who dared outshine him, disobey him, or most dangerous of all, make him look silly. Then there's Haya, his long-suffering, a goddess of marriage who spent most of her time dealing with her husband's affairs by punishing his mistresses and illegitimate children. Not exactly a modern approach to therapy, but it was consistent. Athena, goddess of wisdom, could be and composed one moment, and the next she'd turn a talented weaver into a spider for daring to challenge her craft. The gods did not punish out of fairness, they punished out of offense. And the mortal sin wasn't always murder or treason, it was hubris, the act of stepping out of one's place, trying to be too clever, too proud, too equal to the gods. That in Greek thinking was the ultimate misstep, not evil, but arrogance. And the consequence is eternal. The word hubris doesn't translate neatly into modern English, but think of it as arrogance with a dash of impiety and a dollop of judgment. In Greek tragedy, hubris is what gets heroes killed. Not evil, but the failurato know their limits. Try to fly too high like Icarus, you'll fall. Think you're smarter than Zeus, you'll get chained to a mountain and have your liver pecked out daily. Boast that your children are more beautiful than the gods. You might watch them all perish and be turned to stone from grief. There's no gentle slap on the wrist in myth, there is only spectacle. This reflects how the ancient Greeks saw the world. Mortals were not meant to rival gods. Life was a delicate balance of knowing one's place, honoring the divine, and surviving long enough to die respectably. The punishments in myth weren't just stories. They were cautionary tales, social instruction, and if we're being slightly cynical, entertainment. After all, these myths weren't tucked away in books. They were sung at festivals, painted on pottery, and performed in vast open-air theaters. The Greeks didn't just fear divine punishment, they admired it, the drama of it, the poetry, and sometimes, just sometimes, they suspected that gods enjoyed it too. Consider the logistics. If you were a god and truly wanted to make a point, what would you do? Whisper sternly in someone's ear. Leave a strongly worded letter. Not likely. You'd probably opt for something more theatrical. Turn a man into a stag and let his own dogs tear him apart. Curse a family line for generations. Invent a snake-head monster whose gaze turns people to stone. Classic Da Vinci. In this way, punishment became a kind of performance art, a spectacle of excess, not just pain, but irony. The punishment always fit the crime, but in the most dramatic, often eternal way imaginable. A man cheats death. Let him push a rock forever. A woman boasts of her weaving. Let her weave webs forevermore as a spider. A king refuses to worship Dionysus. Let him be torn to shreds by his own mother in a trance. In myth, punishment is not corrective. It doesn't teach the character anything because the character rarely gets to speak again, but it does teach the audience. It's a sort of divinable board, don't do this. And by this they usually mean don't anger the gods, don't step out of line, and perhaps most of all don't become interesting enough to notice. Now, you may be wondering where is justice in all this. That's a fair question. The ancient Greeks didn't have a linear idea of good and evil, at least not in the modern sense. They had fate, Moira, and fate didn't care about fairness. A person might be doomed from birth, like Oedipus, destined to kill his father and marry his mother despite his best efforts to avoid it. Or like the house of Atros, where everyone seemed cursed simply for being related to a man who served his son at a dinner party. Long story, we'll get to it. The gods weren't always the source of these punishments. Sometimes fate moved even above them. Even Zeus, mighty and bearded, was occasionally at the mercy of fate's slow and dreadful wheel. But when the gods did punish, they often did it not because they had to, but because they could. And so a certain quiet truth emerges from these stories. In Greek myth, punishment is rarely about moral balance. It's about narrative weight, about reminding us how small we are and how easy it is. Top come a cautionary tale. Lest you think this is all just bedtime nonsense, let's gently step into the real world for a moment. The ancient Greeks built dedicated hymns and poured libations to keep the gods appeased, not because they loved them necessarily, but because they feared them. The gods were temperamental landlords in the skies, and you did not want to be the tenant who made too much noise. And yet these same Greeks were philosophers, poets, and playwrights. They questioned the gods. They mocked them gently through satire and tragedy. They used myth as both reverence and rebellion. Euripides, for instance, filled his plays with divine cruelty, not to worship it, but to highlight its absurdity. Punishment then wasn't just a divine decree. It became a conversation about power, about pride, about the fragile line between order and chaos. And as we drift through these myths together, Prometheus and Sisyphus, Niobe and Narration, we begin to see how the Greeks used their stories not to lull themselves with happy endings, but to stare into the truth of being mortal. That truth being, we are small, we are temporary, and we must tread lightly, especially if there's a goddess nearby with a grudge. Oddly enough, all this talk of divinity can feel rather comforting. Why? Because in Greek myth, every misstep has meaning, every error is noticed, every slight, real or imagined, is answered. In a chaotic world, there is something soothing in the idea that the universe cares enough to punish, that even if you are punished unfairly, it's still part of the story, a story bigger than you, a story the gods are watching. Of course, whether that punishment is eternal torment or an awkward transformation into a bush, well, that up to the gods. And they do have a flair for the dramatic. And so, dear listener, we prepare to descend into the quieter shadows of myth. Over the next few chapters, we'll wander gently through the underworlds of punishment, some brutal, some ironic, some unexpectedly beautiful. We'll meet a titan who gave us fire and lost his freedom, a clever king cursed with futility, a mother whose pride became her statue, and a hunter whose last mistake was lancing the wrong direction at the wrong goddess, all of them in their own way punished not for wickedness but for being a little too bold. So take a breath, let the world fall away, and remember, in Greek mythology, justice doesn't come softly, but sleep does, and that at least the gods can't take away from you. Prometheus had a gift for seeing what others could not. A titan by birth, but far from brutish or monstrous. He was clever, thoughtful, dangerous in the way that wisdom often is, and as it turned out, just irritating it to provoke the king of the gods. Now, the thing about titans is, they didn't have a great track record. Most were overthrown during the Titanomachy, the great war between the old gods and the new Olympians. Many were locked away in Tartarus, deep in the bowels of the earth, where the light of the sun was only a rumor. But Prometheus, he made a different choice. He sided with Zeus, a bold move, perhaps a shrewd one. Or maybe he just saw that change was coming and decided it was better to work with the future than against it. For a time, this alliance served him well. The Olympians defeated the Titans, claimed the heavens, and began to shape the world in their image. But once victory was won, Prometheus found himself with little to do. He was clever after all, far too clever to sit quietly on a cloud, so he turned his attention to a peculiar species that had recently begun wandering the earth. Mortals. Upright, soft-skinned, endlessly curious. Compared to gods, they were nothing, barely more than animals with slightly improved posture. But Prometheus saw something in them, a flicker not of fire, not yet, but of potential. The gods weren't interested in these mortals. Zeus in particular seemed to regard them as a passing fancy, a failed project. He wanted them ignorant, dependent, obedient, which is to say boring. He even forbade them from having fire, the divine spark of knowledge, off invention of independence. Prometheus naturally ignored him. There are many versions of how the theft happened. Some say Prometheus scaled Olympus itself, hid a flame inside a hollow fennel, and slipped away unseen. Others say he lit his torch from the fury wheel of his sun chariot as it rolled across the sky. However it happened, the result was the same. Fire came to man. It's easy to forget in our world of electric stoves and glowing screens just what a revolution this was. Fire meant warmth. It meant cooking, forging, protection. It meant light after sunset, and the first real shift in humanity's spazen in the natural order. Before fire we were prey. With fire we could shape the world. Prometheus gave us that, and for that he would pay. Zeus was many things, powerful, regal, occasionally charming, but he was not specially forgiving. To him this was not merely theft, it was defiance, and it made him look weak, which in the celestial pecking order is an unpardonable sin. But Zeus did not rush into a punishment. No, he took his time, plotted, designed something that would sting more than mere death. First, he decided to strike humanity itself. After all, if Prometheus loved mortal so much, what better way to hurt him than to curse his precious creatures? He summoned Testus, the divine blacksmith, and instructed him to fashion a woman, Pandora. Beautiful, charming, and dangerously curious. The gods gifted her with all manner of traits: grace, elegance, musical voice, delicate hands, and the curiosity of 1,000 cats. And they gave her a box, or more accurately, a jar filled with every sorrow and misery imaginable. She opened it. Of course, that was her nature, and from that vessel spilled disease, famine, despair, jealousy, aging, betrayal, every misfortune we now know. By the time she managed to slam the lid shut, only one thing remained inside. Hope. Some say that was a kindness, others think it a cruel joke. The gods, after all, had a flair for poetic ambiguity. With humanity now suitably cursed, Zeus turned to Prometheus. He had the Titans seized by force, chained to the bleak, craggy cliffs of the Caucasus Mountains, a landscape chosen not only for its remoteness but for its utter indifference. Cold wind, endless rock, no shelter. Now at Nis, Prometheus was shackled with divine chains, unbreakable and biting code, and then each day an eagle descended, Zeus's own sacred birds, and torrenteth Titans sighed to feast upon his liver. Not once, not symbolically, but again and again every single day. At night, the liver regenerated. By dawn, the eagle returned. This was the punishment. Not death, but permanence. Not pain alone, but the knowledge that it would never end. In ancient Greek thought, the liver was more than just an organ. It was believed to be the seat of human emotion, the spring of vitality. To have it devoured daily was not just physical torment, but emotional obliteration, a kind of living unmaking, happening in cycles as regular as the sun. And why the eagle? Well, the symbolism writes itself. The king of the sky, Zeus's emblem, feeding on the rebellious Titan. Every feather a reminder that you do not challenge the divine order without conceit. But here's the thing. Prometheus never recanted, he never begged, he never apologized, he endured. In some versions, he even taunts the eagle, perhaps to pass the time, perhaps to remind himself that even in agony heckled still think, still reason, still outwit. He became not just a victim, but a symbol of resistance, of sacrifice, of the cost of giving others the tools to reach its. It's worth noting that this punishment, though epic in its cruelty, was not without historical parallels. The Greeks admired cleverness, but only within bounds. Tricksters were amusing so long as they didn't threaten the gods' authority. Prometheus crossed that line, and he suffered accordingly. Yet over time the culture began to reframe his suffering not as folly but as noble rebellion. By the classical period, Prometheus was being reimagined in plays and poems. Prometheus Bound portrayed him as a tragic hero, a lone voice of compassion standing against divine tyranny. Even in agony he spoke of hope for the future. His words were defiant, not broken. Centuries later, this image only grew. The Romantics adored him. Mary Shelley famously subtitled Frankenstein as modern Prometheus. Poets like Byron and Goethe saw in him the ideal rebel, intelligent, principled, and unyielding. In a world of kings and empires, Prometheus became an icon for the thinker, the artist, the scientist, anyone who dared to reach beyond what allowed. But even myths must eventually move forward. And so we come to the end, or at least the interruption of Prometheus punished him. After many years, a new figure arrived on the scene. Heracles, mortal-born but mighty son of Zeus. Ironically enough, as part of his famous 12 labors, Heracles was passing through the region when he came upon the suffering Titan. He saw the eagle, he saw the chains, and acted. With a single arrow, well aimed and probably quite satisfying, he struck the bird from the sky. The eagle plummeted. Prometheus, for the first time in ages, breathed without agony. Heracles then shattered the chains and freed the Titan. Now, normally this would provoke Zeus's fury, but not this time. Either he had grown bored of the whole affair, or he saw an opportunity to fold this act into Heracles' divine destiny. Some say Zeus had made peace with Prometheus, others suspect he simply didn't want to reward disobedience by reacting to kings have their pride after all. Regardless, Prometheus was free, but freedom came at a cost. In some versions, he had to wear a ring forged from his old chains with a sliver of the mountain stone embedded in it, a symbolic reminder that even freedom has its scars. It was also a clever way for the Greeks to explain the origin of finger rings. Yes, even jewelry has its mythological backstory. And so, the Titan who gave us fire was at last released. But the story doesn't end there. Prometheus continued to appear in later myths, often as a prophet or wise advisor. He had glimpsed the future. After all, he knew things even the gods didn't. He had warned Zeus once long ago about Archel born to Thetis who would surpass his father in greatness. That warning had led Zeus to marry her off to a mortal, which eventually gave us Okul. But that's another tale. What remains through all the centuries is the legacy. Prometheus is more than a character. He is an idea. The idea that knowledge matters, that sacrifice can be noble, that sometimes doing the right thing means suffering. for it, and in the quiet hours of the night, when the world has gone still, there's a certain comfort in that one figure, bound, bleeding, and burning with resolve, held fast in the name of compassion, that a spark is given can never be taken back. As you drift now, perhaps you imagine that spark glowing gently, flickering, not in firewood or torchlight, but in the minds of dreamers, carried from age to age, whispered in myth and story. The eagle is gone, the chains are broken, the mountain sleeps, and Prometheus, well, he's still thinking. Let that be enough for tonight. Sisyphus was the sort of man who could talk his way out of anything. And that in the end was exactly that. He was not a hero in the classical sense. He wasn't blessed with divine strength or chosen by the gods for greatness. His name didn't inspire bars to reach for their lyres or for warriors to raise a toast. Sisyphus was above all else clever, and in ancient Greece, cleverness, too much of it, could be dangerous. He ruled Thessaly of Corinth, or Epha, as it was called in those days, a prosperous port set between mountains and sea, the kind of place where trade flowed and tongues wagged. Under Sisyphus it became wealthy, lively, and ever so slightly corrupt. He taxed the travelers, tricked his guests, and filled his treasury with coins wrung from diplomatic loopholes and creative accounting. He was, as you may imagine, not specially popular among the gods. Zeus in particular found him insufferable. There was the time Sisyphus revealed one of Zeus's rather scandalous affairs, not out of moral outrage, mind you, but to curry favor with a river god. Another time he invited travelers to his city with promises of hospitality and lead to murder them and steal their belongings. It wasn't very sporting, but none of this was quite enough to earn eternal torment. Not yet. What sealed Sisyphus' fate was something far more ambitious. He tricked death. Now, death in Greek mythology isn't a grim reaper with a cloak and a sieve. He's Tantalus, silent, solemn, Andro the businesslike. He arrives when it's your time, and he does his job with minimal fuss. But when Tantalus arrived to collect Sisyphus, he found a man ready for him. Sisyphus had prepared a set of chains. He welcomed death, offered him wine, engaged him in polite conversation, and then, when the moment was right, bound Tantalus in his own shackles. And so for a time no one could die. It was a small miracle at first. Soldiers survived their wounds. The sick began to recover. Sacrifices wouldn't die on altars, a rather awkward problem for priests. Even old age itself seemed to pause, but soon the miracle wore thin. Those who should have passed were left in pain. Battles turned into endless brawls. The earth groaned under the weight of the people who longed for peace were denied it. And the gods were furious. Eventually Eris, god of war and very much inconvenienced by this pause in battlefield casualties, stormed into Corinth, tore open the dungeon, and freed them. Then death resumed his duties. The balance of the world was restored, and Sisyphus he was seized at last and carried down to the underworld. But if you think that was the end of it, well, you've not yet understood Sisyphus. Before he died, he gave his wife an instruction. When I'm gone, he said, do not bury me, do not honor me. Leave me unwashed, unrobed, and coinless. A curious request, one might think, but very intentional. You see, in Greek belief, the soul could not properly enter the underworld without the rites. The coin beneath the tongue was for Charon, the ferryman, who rowed the dead across the river Styx. Without it, a soul would be stranded at a river's edge like a traveler at a locked gate. Sisyphus used this loophole to his advantage. When he arrived in the underworld, he protested. My wife has dishonored me, he cried. She has refused my burial, denied me my rights. Let me return to the land of the living for just a few days to correct this offense. I promise to come back. Fanny, queen of the underworld, was moved, or perhaps she was merely tired of the noise. She allowed him to return, and return he did. Not for a day, not for a week, but indefinitely. He resumed his rule, walked the streets, held court, laughed, drank, and smiled smugly at the skies. He had outwitted death twice, but of course the gods do not forget. Hermes, swift and sharp, was sent to retrieve him. No tricks this time, no excuses. Sisyphus was dragged down once more, this time for good, and then the sentence was passed. Now, you might expect a thunderbolt, a lake of fire, perhaps a monstrous serpent, but no. The punishment was a stone, a simple boulder, massive, smooth, and impossibly heavy. Sisyphus was placed at the base of a great hill. He was to roll the boulder to the top, nothing more. No whips, no canes, just the stone and the slope. So he pushed, muscles straining, feet slipping. Hours passed, then days, then years. With each push he drew closer to the peak. But every time the boulder would slip from his grasp just before the summit, it would roll back down, thundering, into the dust, and Sisyphus would begin again. There is no rest, no end, no applause, only effort, futility, repetition. This is what the gods devised for a man too clever to die. And it worked beautifully. There's something devastating about a task with no meaning, no goal, no finish line. Other torments offer at least the possibility of resolution. This one does not. You may wonder, why Zach a punishment? Why not pain or fire or something loud and dramatic? Because the Greeks understood something quietly terrifying. The worst suffering is not violence but meaninglessness. To struggle without purpose. 2. Strive and never achieve. That is the root. And for a man like Sisyphus who had always found a way out, there would have none this time. Yet centuries later, something curious happened. In the 20th century, the French philosopher Albert Camus imagined Sisyphus in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. Camus called him the absurd hero, a man who rebels is not with weapons but with persistence. He imagined Sisyphus at the moment the boulder rolled back, as he turned to descend a hill, not with despair, but with awareness. Camus argued that by knowing the futility in pushing anyway, Sisyphus became free. The struggle itself, Camus wrote, toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. It's a radical idea. That joy could exist within endless labor. That purpose could emerge from the choice to keep going. Perhaps Camus was right, or perhaps he was just being poetic. But it's comforting to think that even in myth, where punishment often defines a person, there is still room for dignity. Of course, the ancient Greeks likely didn't intend such optimism. To them, Sisyphus was a cautionary tale, a man whose pride defied divine law, who professed to accept his mortality, and who paid the price. But the beauty of myth is that it survives. Reinterpretation, it stretches, it adapts. And so, Sisyphus rolls on, not just in Hades but in art, in thought, and in quiet human struggles everywhere. We are in small ways all Sisyphus. We rise each day. We face our tasks. We carry our weights. We slip, fall, and start again. And in the gentle hours of the night, when the world forgets stillness, that eternal hill doesn't feel so far away. Imagine it now, the quiet crunch of gravel underfoot, the early light of dawn brushing the slope, the boulder waiting, not menacing, but familiar. Sisyphus wipes his brow, sets his hands, breathes, and begins again. Not with anger, not with fear, just the rhythm of effort, the calm and repetition, the knowledge that the gods can only punish so much, and beyond that there is peace and persistence. Let your own thoughts settle now, let the hill fade, let the boulder roll softly out of view. You are not trapped in the task, you're simply resting from it. Sleep well. Tantalus was once beloved by the gods, not merely tolerated, not grudgingly invited to Olympus like some misbehaving demigod cousin, but truly welcome meet a mortal king, perhaps even the son of Zeus himself, depending on which poet you ask, and held in high regard by those who rarely held mortals in anything but contempt. He dined at their table, he drank their nectar, he was allowed into their secrets, however cautiously, and as you might expect, that went terribly because in Greek mythology, the surest way to ensure your own downfall is not to defy the gods, but to be too close to them, to step into their world, and forget even for a moment that you are not one of them, that you are dust and they are eternal. Tantalus forgot, or perhaps he simply chose not to remember. He ruled over Lydia, a wealthy kingdom known for its gold and grandeur. By all accounts he had everything a man could ask for. Power, influence, divine favor, and yet it wasn't enough. It rarely is in stories like this. Satisfaction is not a virtue in myth. Longing is, and Tantalus, for all his blessings, longed for more. Some say he began stealing food from Olympus, not because he needed it, but because he could. Ambrosia and nectar, the divine sustenance that kept the gods immortal, spirited away and handed to mortals as petty favors, an act that might be considered generous if it weren't also the equivalent of watering down the sacred wine. Others say he shared the secrets of Thegid's prophecies, divine plans, gossip perhaps. He took what was whispered in confidence and carried it down to earth, the way one might pinch a fig from a sacred grove and offer it as dessert at dinner. But worst of all, in the most infamous version of the myth, Tantalus devised a test. He wanted to see whether the gods truly were all-knowing, whether their claims to wisdom were more than ceremonial. So he invited them to a feast, and there, in a gesture so grotesque it strains belief, he served them a stew made from his own son. Pelops, it's worth pausing here, because even by the standards of Greek tragedy, this is excessive. Why? That's the eternal question. Was it arrogance, insanity, a cynical, philosophical experiment? Perhaps Tantalus believed the gods wouldn't notice, or perhaps he hoped they would, and the horror would somehow affirm their divinity. Either way, he dismembered his own child, boiled the pieces, and placed the dish before the gods. They did notice, all of them except Dido, still grieving the abduction of her daughter. Persephone was too distracted to pay attention. She took a single bite of shoulder before the truth was revealed. The gods recoiled in revulsion, but they also responded with a kind of eerie precision. They reassembled the boy, restored him to life, and replaced the missing shoulder with one crafted from ivory. Pelops, as it happens, would go on to have his own mythic saga, chariot races, curses, and children who made Greek theater look like an episode of daytime television. But Tantalus, he would be punished, and not in the usual fashion. Zeus didn't just strike him down. He didn't chain him in Tartarus or hurl him from Olympus. No, Tantalus was given a punishment that matched his, not in violence but in symbolism. He was placed in the afterlife, in a special part of Hades, designed just for him, a personal hell sculpted with exquisite irony. He was made to stand in a shallow pool of water. Around him grew trees, heavy with fruit, apples, figs, pomegranates. The air was warm, the branches bowed with abundance, a feast for the senses. And he was starving. Whenever he bent down to drink, the water would drain away from his lips. Whenever he reached up to pluck a fruit, the branches would sway just out of reach. An eternal cycle of hunger and denial. That in essence is the punishment. Not fire, not chains, but endless almost. Tantalus is not torn apart. He is not howling in pain. He is simply waiting, longing in a state of perpetual frustration. The fruit glows golden in the light. The water laps gently at his knees, but neither will ever satisfy. Is a punishment so elegant it almost feels quiet. No blood, no screaming, just yearning and absence. That's where we get the word tantalize. Of course, to torment someone with the promise of something they cannot have. You've likely felt it in your own life. The job interview that went well but never called back. The dessert behind the glass just before payday. The endless scroll of what could be. Tantalus lives in that space forever. The ancient Greeks had a knack for poetic justice. Their punishments were rarely random. They echoed the crime. Tantalus, who once fed the gods something unspeakable, is now surrounded by food he cannot taste. He who played with the divine order of nourishment and sacrifice now hungers in the shadow of Flinty. His crime wasn't just murder. It was the desecration of hospitality, a sacred value in ancient Greece. Xenia, the guest friend bond, was protected by Zeus himself. To betray your guests or your hosts was to violate one of the pillars of Greek culture. Tantalus had eaten at the god's table and then offered them horror in return. His punishment then is not just a torment but an exile. He is no longer welcome at any table. Not mortal, not divine. He stands alone in a world that offers but never gives. It's deeply mythic, yes, but also quietly human. We all live with wants we cannot reach, desires that slip just out of grasp. Tantalus' pool is not only in the underworld. It is in the heart that longs and waits and never receives. And that is perhaps why history endures, not just because it's strange or grotesque, but because it reflects something familiar. That quiet ache, that reaching dot. The Greeks knew this feeling. Their world was one of scarcity, of fate, of regal hopes. They built temples to thank the gods, yes, but also to beg them, to plead, to offer wine and grain in exchange for rain, for safety, for justice. Tantalus was a reminder of what happens when you take without reverence, when you cross the line, not just of propriety, but of sacred order. And yet there is a softness in his sentence, a sort of terrible gentleness. No tormentor, no lash, just the whisper of water and the rustle of leaves, again and again forever. Art and literature have returned to Tantalus again and again. Painters have shown him half submerged, reaching upward. Writers have invoked him as metaphor. Philosophers from Plato to nature have seen in him the embodiment of unmetasia, the tragedy of being almost divine and yet bound by mortal, hungers. In some versions he cries out, in others he grows silent. Perhaps with time he no longer reaches, perhaps he stands still, neck deep in memory, letting the wind and water swirl around him like the past. Or perhaps, and this is the cruelest possibility of all, he continues to believe that maybe next time the water will stay, that this time the fruit will not move. That hope so famously left behind in Pandora's jar has found a new home in him. That, too, is its own punishment. Let your mind now drift to that strange orchard. The light is soft, the pool is, the trees hang heavy, swaying in the gentlest breeze, and there in the middle stands a man, not screaming, not weeping, just reaching, and the fruit is always just beyond his fingertips, and the water is always just below his lips. And time does not pass, or if it does, he cannot tell. Sleep now. You're not in that orchard. Your hungers are real, but they end. Your thirsts will be quenched. The fruit will not always sway away from you. But for now, let the image fade, and let Thagard's petty, poetic, eternal go on punishing those who reach too far. You need only close your eyes. The feast will still be there when you wake. Niobe was a queen, proud, radiant, and surrounded by children. So many children, in fact, that she sometimes lost count. Some say she had 6 sons and 6 daughters. Others say 7 and 7. A perfect symmetry, a full house, a mother's triumph. And Niobe was very proud of that. Too proud. She ruled the city of Thebes beside her husband. Amphion, a man said to have built the city's walls with the music of his lyre. The two of them were a golden couple, noble, talented, blessed. But it was Niobe who drew the eye, not just for her beauty, but for her confidence, her certainty, her sense that she had earned, perhaps even deserved, everything she had. And this is where the trouble began. You see, pride in Greek myth is never just about being pleased with your accomplishments. It's about overstepping, forgetting one's place, and in Niobe's case, she began to forget that she was mortal. One day, as the city prepared to honor the goddess Leto, a quiet, dignified deity known mostly for giving birth, tough twin gods Apollo and Artemis, Niobe looked around and asked a dangerous question. Why should the people worship Leto who had only 2 children when Niobe herself had many? It wasn't shouted, it wasn't carved into stone. It was, as these things often are, a moment of misplaced confidence. A queen surrounded by daughters and sons, looking at the temple preparations and thinking, surely I am more deserving of reverence than she. There's a word for this, of course. Hubris, mortal arrogance, the crime of thinking yourself equal to a god or worse, a superior, and in Greek mythology hubris never goes unanswered. Leto heard the insult, not directly perhaps, gods rarely eavesdrop in person, but words have a way of reaching Olympus, and though Leto was known for her grace, her response came through her children. She didn't send a plague. She didn't shake the earth, she simply sent their son and daughter. Apollo, god of music, prophecy, and light, and Artemis, goddess of the hunt, of wild animals and young women, divine twins, born of Thesan mother that Niobe had mocked. They descended quietly, and one by one they killed Niobe's children. Some say Apollo took the sons and Artemis fed others. Others say Artemis spared one daughter or two, depending on the version, while Apollo left one son alive to carry the memory. The stories shift as myths often do, but the essence remains. Niobe, the mother of many, became the mother of none. There was no battle, no defense. The children fell in the fields in Thepales by the altar. They died not because they had sinned, but because Athe had been born to a mother who spoke too freely. Niobe fled. She ran to Mount Sisyphus, her childhood home, weeping and hollow with grief. And there she begged the gods, not for mercy, not for vengeance, but for release, for the end of suffering. And the gods answered. They turned her to stone. She became a part of the mountain, her form frozen in rock, her face tilted downward. Her eyes, it said, continued to weep, a slow eternal spring that trickled from the cliffside like tears that time could not dry. Even in her silence Niobe mourned. There are many kinds of punishment in myth. Some are loud, filled with screaming and fire and spectacle. Others, like Niobe's, are quiet, still eternal. She wasn't torn apart or cast into Tartarus. She wasn't made to suffer grotesque physical torment. She was simply left with the memory frozen alone weeping. And this in many ways is a more intimate kind of punishment. One that doesn't rely on chains or monsters, but on grief. A mother who once counted her children as trophies is now left to count only their absence. The myth serves, of course, as a warning. Don't boast, don't compare, don't place yourself above the gods, especially in matters as sacred as birth and motherhood. Leto had only 2 children, but the Setwa were divine. Niobe had many, but they were mortal. And in the cosmicals of Olympus, quality outweighs quantity. Or so the gods would have us believe, but there's something else, too. Something deeper. Niobe's story isn't just about punishment, it's about the fragility of joy. The swiftness with which life can turn from fullness to emptiness. The way pride and love are often tangled together, indistinguishable until it's too late. She loved her children, that's rarely questioned. Her crime wasn't hatred or neglect, it was pride. She loved them too much. Or perhaps more precisely, she loved what they said about her. And who among us hasn't done the same, placed our self-worth in our accomplishments, our family, our reputation? Niobe is tragic, not because she was monstrous, but because she was recognizably human. Her transformation into stone also reflects an ancient idea, that overwhelming grief turns people into something less alive, that mourning carried to long hardens turns inward, becomes landscape. The Greeks understood this. They made their myths not just to frighten or entertain, but to explain. A rocky cliff that seemed to resemble a woman's face, that was sorrow made permanent. That was what became of a queen who boasted too loudly. In some parts of Turkey on Mount Sisyphus there is a rock formation that locals for centuries have called the Weeping Rock. Water drips from it slow and steady, and though geologists will tell you it's groundwater seeping through limestone, the myth remains. Even today, travelers visit the mountain and say, there that is Niobe, not an M carved in marble, not a poem, a rock weeping. Niobe appears in later literature, to a symbol of maternal grief, of arrogance punished, but Alsuf's sorrow immortalized. In Dante's Inferno, she is mentioned among the weeping souls. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, the prince compares his mother's remarriage to Niobe's tears, suggesting, perhaps unfairly, that her mourning was unlimited. But Niobe herself never speaks again. That is part of her punishment, and perhaps her absolution. She who once spoke too boldly now says nothing. Only the water speaks for her. There is a quiet power in that, Araminda, that some wounds never find words. And perhaps, just perhaps, the gods in their own cold way showed her mercy. She was not erased, not hurled into oblivion. She was given a form that could endure. She was allowed to mourn. Pride turned to stone. Love turned to legend. Let your thoughts drift if you wish. Tossed out mountainside. The wind is soft. The rock is warm beneath the sun. And from a crevice the water trickles, not loudly but steadily. The tears of a mother who once had everything and now has only this. There are no gods in sight. No thunderbolts. Just silence and time. Niobe is still there. Or the idea of her is unmoving, unforgetting. And as you lie still, perhaps you feel a little of her stillness. Not her sorrow that is hers alone, but the peace that comes after the hush. For For the Greeks, grief was a sacred thing. It had rituals, garments, timelines. To mourn was to honor, but to mourn forever, that was dangerous. That could twist their soul. So the story of Niobe stands as both warning and elegy. Don't boast, but also, don't forget. She reminds us that children are not possessions, that life is fragile, that even love can invite ruin when pride walks too closely beside it. And so she weeps, not in rage, not in drama, but in that slow geological way that only myths and mountains understand. Sleep now, if you will. You are not stone. You are soft and warm and living. And Niobe will keep watch. She has been doing it for a very, very long time. Acton was a hunter, not a king, not a demigod, not a schemer or philosopher, just a man with a bow, a pack of hounds, and a love for the wilderness. He was the kind of person who found silence more agreeable than song, whose temples were the forests, and whose prayers were arrows loosed into the wind. In other words, the sort of man who kept mostly to himself, and might have lived a long and peaceful life, if not for one unlucky moment. The story begins in the high hills of Boeotia, in central Greece, where sunlight filters through thick canopies and the air carries the scent of pine and moss. There Acton hunted. He knew the paths, the watering holes, the secret places where deer tread softly. His dogs, 50 in some versions, more in others, moved with him as if part of his own limbs. Theirs was a quiet, sacred bond, built even in those wooded hills. A man is never far from a god, and in Acton's case he was far too close. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and Thea turned gold, Acton wandered from his companions. Perhaps he followed the scent of game. Perhaps he was simply thirsty. Perhaps, as some versions of the myth suggest, he was led by fate. What he found deep in a hidden glade was a pool, not a muddy animal trough or a trickling stream, but a sacred spring. The kinthat sings gently as it spills from the rocks, its surface still and glassy. Anthea, within that secluded water, bathed the goddess, Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt, of wild creatures of the moon. She who ran faster than deer and struck more surely than mortal hands could imagine. She who loved her solitude, her sisterhood of nymphs, her untouched freedom. She was not dressed for the court. She was not cloaked in thunder or fire. She was simply bathing bare and unguarded in the place she believed was hers alone. And then she saw him. Acton stood frozen. One step too far, one breath too loud. He had not spoken. He had not meant to spy. But his eyes had opened. And that was enough. Because in Greek myth there are few scenes more dangerous than seeing something the gods did not intend you to see, especially her. The scene freezes here in many retellings, a long suspended breath. The startled goddess, her arm half raised. In reflex, the young hunter caught not in lust or conquest, but in raw, paralyzing astonishment, not desire, just shock, a moment neither of them chose, but the gods are not known for nuance. Artemis reacted in a flash. She reached for the nearest thing, water, and flung it in his direction. The spell was spoken, or perhaps not spoken at all. With the splash of that sacred spring, Acton began to change. His limbs bent, his spine twisted. His hands, which once knocked arrows and brushed fur, grew narrow, cloven, and wild. His tongue thickened, his eyes widened. He was no longer a man, he was a stag. A great, strong, terrified deer, trembling in the grass, antler heavy on his head. Mind still human, but body ruled by instinct and fear. And somewhere in the distance his dogs caught his scent. What happened next is difficult telling on, but we must gently. His hounds came bounding. The pack hayhod raised from pups towards track, to kill, to obey. They knew his voice better than thunder. But now they did know him. They saw only the stag, and they did what they had been trained to do. They gave chase. Acton ran. The forest, once his home, blurred past him in panic. His hooves slipped on moss. Branches scraped his sides. The scent of his own fear filled the air. The dogs followed, snarling and hungry with purpose. No commands came to stop them, only the echo of what once was. And then, when he could run no more, they tore him apart. The hunter underneath his own hounds, the man who knew the woods better than anyone, now buried in thin, not by ceremony, but by silence. There are no songs about his bravery, no temple raised in his name. He is remembered, if he is remembered at all, as a cautionary tale. Do not look upon what is forbidden. Do not see what is occurred, but what exactly was his crime. In some tellings it was pure accidental, a misstep, a wrong turn, the tragedy of bad timing. In others, the story is less gentle. Acton is said to have bragged, to have boasted that he was a better hunter than Artemis herself. Or in some darker versions that he had sought her on purpose, that his eyes were not innocent, but full of conquest. The myth is flexible, it adapts, to the time, to the teller, to the needs of the audience, but the punishment remains the same. And perhaps that is the point, because Artemis, for all her grace and purity, is not merciful. She is fierce, she protects her boundaries, she defends her mysteries. She is not a goddess to be explained. She is a force to be accepted, and when her privacy is broken, when her divine space is pierced, no matter how accidentally, she does not forgive. The transformation into a stag is no coincidence. Artemis is the goddess of the wild. To turn a man into prey is not just revenge. It's symbolism. It flips the order of the world. The hunter becomes the hunted, the master becomes the beast. The loyal hounds, once his pride, become the tit of justice. There's something terrifying in that symmetry, something mythically precise, but there's also something very human in Acton's fate. How many times in history, in literature, in our own lives, has someone seen something they weren't meant to, learned a truth too early, witnessed a secret, a sorrow, a private pain, and been punished for knowing? Acton's sin is visibility, and his punishment is erasure. He is silenced, removed. His memory exists not as a hero, but as a warning, a whisper. Don't go too far into the woods, don't look too long, don't follow the sound of water. And yet, we do. Humans are wayward. We are drawn to mystery, to beauty, to the edges of what we understand. That's the tragedy of Acton. He did what so many do, walked a little too far, looked a little too long, asked a question with his eyes, and found no answer, only punishment. And Artemis, she remains untouched. She slips back into the glade. The water stills, the leaves grow quiet, and the myth rolls forward. Some say that after his death, the gods took pity on Acton, that his soul was welcomed gently into the afterlife. Thoth was restored in some other form, somewhere else. Others say nothing, just a story, just a name, just a man who became a deer, and then a memory. Let your thoughts settle now in that forest. The air is cool, the light filters softly through the trees, a stream trickles nearby, its water clear and cold. You walk carefully, respectfully. The dogs are gone. The hunt is ended. There is only peace here now, and if you look, not too long, not too close, you might see the shadow of antlers in the trees, the flicker of a shape that once was human, a whisper of a man who saw and ran and fell. The gods are not watching, not tonight, but the woods are. Let them keep you safe. Let sleep come like mist among the trees. Let the story end in silence. Aract was born without a drop of divine blood. No noble lineage, no famous father or magical prophecy. She was just a girl from Lydia, a small region in Asia Minor, known more for its wool than its warriors. Her parents were humble. Her mother wove cloth for the markets. Her father dyed the thread, soaking the fibers in purple drawn from rare sea snails. They were not wealthy, but their household was quiet, industrious, and content. And into that quiet life, Aract beauty. From a young age, her hands worked the loom with a skill that felt more than human. Her fingers danced through the warp and weft, coaxing silk and wool into patterns so fine, so impossibly delicate that even the older women at market paused to watch. Her tapestries shimmered like water, breathed like clouds. Birds stitched in threads seemed ready to fly. Leaves wove themselves into breezes. Horses galloped across linen fields. People began to talk. Some said she must have been taught by the goddess, Athena herself, the patroness of wisdom, of crafts, of weaving. Who else could explain such talent? But Arachne, perhaps still young or perhaps already growing tired of the whispers, said no. She had learned from no one. Her skill was her own. Hard, won, practiced, perfected. And then she said something she should not have said. She claimed she was better than Athena, not just gifted, not equal, better. In Greek mythology, this is where the quiet part of the story ends, because no matter how skilled or beloved a mortal is, comparing oneself to a god, or worse, outshining them is the spark that lights the fuse. The word for this once again is hubris. It is not always wickedness that invites divine wrath. Sometimes it's simply the act of forgetting that you are small, that your place in the cosmos is below, not level, not above, just below. And so, as stories go, the goddess heard her name spoken. Athena, daughter of Zeus, great and ever-watch, listened as this mortal girl declared herself the superior weaver, and to no one's surprise, she came down to earth to see for herself. But gods don't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come in disguise. Athena took the form of an old woman, hunched, wrinkled, with eyes like polished stone. She visited Arachne's workshop and offered a warning. A chance, really. She told her, be humble. Thank the gods for your gift. Apologize. Turned back. Arachne, flushed with youth or blinded by pride, perhaps both, refused. She said plainly that she stood by her claim, that she would welcome a contest, that if the goddess of weaving thought herself so superior, she should prove it. And Athena, no longer amused, revealed herself. Her disguise fell like a shawl. She stood tall, glowing in her divinity, her grey eyes blazing, not with rage, but with something colder. Resolve. The contest began. 2 looms, 2 sets of threads, 2 women, 1 mortal, 1 a divine, side by side in silence. The challenge wasn't just about skill, it was about artistry, vision. Who could best tell a story through fabric and thread? Athena wove first. Her tapestry was filled with order and glorying in rich regal tones. She depicted the triumphs of the gods, scenes of Olympus at peace, of mortals paying homage, of divine justice reigning over the world. At each corner, she wove cautionary tales, mortals punished for pride, for disrespect, for thinking themselves too clever. It was essentially a threat stitched in gold. Arachne wove next, and her tapestry was flawless. She chose a different story. She showed the gods not as just a kind, but as flawed, as cruel, as selfish. She wove scene after Venus misconduct, Zeus seducing mortal women in the guise of swans and bulls, Poseidon chasing nymphs, Apollo abandoning lovers. She did not lie. These were tales known and whispered, painted on vases and sung in secret, but she told them with such precision, such beauty that her work glowed. Even Athena, it said, could find no fault in the craftsmanship. And yet the message was clear. Arachne had done more than compete, she had accused. The room was silent. Thea stood. The mortal girl held her breath, and then Athena tore tapestry to pieces. She did not strike Arachne. She didn't need to. Her fingers tore through the cloth like wind through silk. The threads unraveled, the scenes dissolved, and Arachne, humiliated and overwhelmed, did what mortals often do when they learn that gods can destroy what they love most. She fled, she wept, and then, in some versions, she hanged herself. The myth doesn't pause to consider how young she was, or how cruel it is to give someone talent and then punish them for using it truthfully. But Athena, perhaps feeling the weight of her own fury, chose not to let Arachne die. She touched the girl's body and changed it. Her limbs shrank. Her skin darkened. Her fingers multiplied and thinned. Her eyes grew. Her body rounded. Arachne became the first spider. Ange would weave forever, no longer on a loom, but in corners, in rafters, in shadows. Her tapestries, now made of silk, no longer told stories, not ones we can read, but they glistened in dew, shimmered in moonlight. They captured not fame or reverence but flies. Her punishment was not pain, it was transformation. Athena did not kill her. She gave her eternity, but not as a girl, not as a rival, as a creature beneath, noticed spinning quietly in the corners of the world. And there she remains. It's easy perhaps to miss the cruelty in this myth. Arachne is not burned, not banished, not torn apart, but she is reduced. She is made less than she wasn't, made eternal. It is the punishment of visibility turned to invisibility. A girl once praised across cities is now something you flick away or trap in a glass, and yet she spins. Despite everything, the spider still weaves. Even today, their webs, intricate, patient, purposeful, remain a testament to a girl who once dared to speak truth through thread. The myth of Arachne raises questions that never quite settle. Was she wrong to boast? Was she foolish to speak through her craft? Should she have lied? Would that have saved her? Or was this always her fate, to create something perfect and be punished not for the work but for who she was? In Greek mythology, talent is often a double-edged gift. Mortals are praised for their gifts, then punished for enjoying them too much. Daedalus built wings and lost his son. Orpheus sung too beautifully and turned to look. Oricon wove too well and told the wrong stories. Perhaps the real crime wasn't that she challenged the gods, but that she revealed them. Athena is often described as a wise goddess, thoughtful, measured, but wisdom, when wounded, can be sharp. She didn't just win the contest. She ensured that Arachne would never be able to create again as a human, only as a whisper, a thread. And yet spiders continue, patient, silent, meticulous. They spin in barns and caves and windowsills. Their silk, stronger than steel, invisible until it glints. They are not celebrated, but they endure. And in that quiet perseverance, perhaps Arachne has found a kind of peace. Let your mind drift now to a small dark corner of a quiet house. A web stretches across a beam, delicate, intricate, unnoticed by most. And in its center a tiny creature waits, not in fear, not in anger, just in stillness. She no longer boasts. She no longer weeps. She simply. And in the hush of night, when the world is asleep and the gods have turned their eyes elsewhere, the spider remembers who she was, not with regret, but with the calm of someone who told the truth once and never had to speak again. Let that silence hold you now. The loom is gone, but the thread continues. Sleep as Arachne spins. Pentheus was a rational man, a king, young, sharp and confident, perhaps a little too confident. He ruled over Thebes, the ancient city famed for drama, for tragedy, and for never quite getting a quiet day. Pentheus had inherited the throne from his grandfather Cadmus, and unlike the old king, he had little time for gods, omens, or mystery. Where others saw signs, Pentheus saw disorder. Where others whispered of divinity, he spoke of discipline. And of all the gods, there was one he found especially distasteful: Dionysus, the god of wine, of revelry, of madness, the bringer of ecstasy and confusion, a god who danced where others marched, who laughed where others lectured. To Pentheus, Dionysus was the embodiment of everything a kingdom should avoid: wildness, emotion, chaos, the unbuttoning of the human mind. He did not fear this god, he despised him. And when word reached Thebes that Dionysus had returned, spreading his cult across the countryside, Pentheus was not impressed. The stories were already swirling. Women leaving their homes, abandoning their looms and cradles, running off into the mountains, dancing, singing, tearing animals apart with their bare hands. The Bacchae they were called, female followers of Dionysus, caught in holy madness. To Pentheus, it sounded like hysteria, disorder masquerading as religion. And so he did what kings often do when faced with something they don't understand. He cracked down. He ordered the Bacchae banned, the vineyards uprooted, Thedrums silenced. He sent soldiers into the hills to arrest the women and bring them back in case he was going to restore order, reason to thieves. And then a stranger revved handsome.com, with eyes that glinted like dark wine. He wore no armor, he carried no weapon, but when he spoke people listened. He claimed to be a follower of Dionysus, and more than that, a living testament to God's power. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he simply said that the god had returned and that those who rejected him would suffer. Pentheus, of course, had him arrested. The stranger went peacefully. The guards dragged him to the palace and threw him into the dungeon. Pentheus came down to see him, to question him, to mock him, and there, in the dark of the prison, the stranger warned him Dionysus does not like to be ignored, but Pentheus. Oh, Pentheus laughed. He mocked the stranger's long hair, his soft hands, his feminine robes. He called him weak, deluded. He threatened to torture him, to cut off his hair, to show him what power really looked like. And still the stranger smiled. When the guards tried to shackle him, the palace trembled, the chains fell, the torches blew out, the doors swung open on their own. The stranger vanished, not with a bang, but with a sigh. And suddenly Pentheus found himself curious. He called his advisors, asked them about the batch. What did they really do out there in the woods? What rituals did they perform? What did they wear? He wanted to go to see, but how? A king would never. Bellowed, the women would scatter, the rituals would stop. And then the stranger returned. He offered a disguise, a dress, a wig, a veil. Let me make you one of them, he said. Let me take you to the mountain, and you can see for yourself what Dionysus does. While and Pentheus logical, practical, proud, Pentheus agreed. Why? Perhaps it was madness or vanity, or the first sip of Dionysus' influence, not in but in curiosity. He dressed, he painted his face, Hesmalled into a mirror, and thought for a moment that he looked rather fine. The stranger led him into the woods, and the trees grew darker. Up the mountain they went deeper into the land of ivy. Andrums, the wind sang through the leaves. A scent of wine and earth filled the air, and then voices, laughter, song, shrieks of joy. The back danced in a clearing, wild and radiant. They moved like creatures without weight. Their eyes glowed with something not entirely human. Pentheus stood behind a tree, peering through the leaves, watching. He didn't understand what he was seeing. The ritual was beyond words. It was not reason. It was not logic. It was surrender. These women were not out of control. They were freed. And in that moment, something in him shifted, but it was too late. The stranger whispered one final word in his ear and left, and the bake turned. He saw the intruder, this false woman, hiding behind the branches, and madness filled them. This is the heart of Dionysus' power. Not destruction, but dissolution. He does not burn you, he unravels you. The baches surged forward. They tore through the trees. They seized Pentheus, still in his dress, still stunned, still reaching for a name he could no longer remember. And among them was Agave, his mother. She too was deep in the god's trance. She saw not her son, but a lion, a beast, a threat to the sacred grove. She led the charge. She took his head, and only later, as she carried it down the mountain in triumph, did the madness fade. She saw what she held, what she had done, and she wept. Pentheus' body was buried quietly. There was no royal funeral, no grand speeches. Thieves fell into silence, and the stranger, he revealed himself fully at last. He was Dionysus, god, not just of wine, but of transformation, of blurred lines, of the soft places where control gives way. Tachos. He had warned them. He had offered grace, and now he was done. He left a city just as softly as he had arrived. What do we make of this story? It is not a tale of evil punished. Pentheus was not a monster. He was proud, rigid, afraid of what he could not command. And that is what Dionysus punishes. Not crime, but resistance. In Greek thought, Dionysus is the god who reveals what we keep hidden. He tears away masks. Not to mock, but to liberate. To show you who you are when no one is watching. Pentheus could not bear that, and so he became the mask. The myth is haunting because it is not wrong to seek order, but when order becomes denial, when structure becomes fear, the gods send their answers in madness. There is something modern about Dionysus, something psychological. He represents the part of us we lock away, the cry we silence, the truth and when we ignore it too long it finds us. In Greek tragedy, this story is told by Euripides in the Batch, a play where Theaget is both gentle and terrifying, where the chorus sings of freedom and the stage ends in blood. But Euripides, ever the ironist, does not give us easy answers. He does not say Dionysus is right. He simply says this is what happens. You cannot suppress the soul forever, and if you try, it will reset. In many ways, this is a story about the cost of ignoring what is wild in ourselves, about what happens when we mock the parts of life that don't fit neatly into reason, about what happens when we stare too long at the mirror and forget who are staring back. Let your thoughts drift now to that mountain. The drums have faded. The women sleep. The wind moves softly through the trees, and somewhere deeper still, the god smiles, not in vengeance, but in understanding. He knows that sleep, too, is a kind of surrender, so let go. Let the city of thieves fall silence. Let the wild pass by. And let the night carry you gently into dreams beyond the edge of reason. Tiresias was not born into greatness. His name did not inspire awe when he was young. He wasn't visited by oracles in his cradle or singled out by gods with glowing prophecy. He was at first simply a child in the city of Thebes, a place that seemed to attract more than its share of disasters and destinies. Thebes was not quiet, but Tiresias was from his earliest years. He was a watcher, not a daydreamer exactly, just someone who saw more than he said, who listened when others talked and noticed when others overlooked. He paid attention to little things, patterns in birdsong, the shift of wind before rain, the way someone's eyes lingered too long on silence. It's tempting to call him wise even as a boy, but that's not quite true. He was curious, alert, sensitive to the movements of the world, and that eventually led him into the woods on Dinto myth. The moment that changed him forever did not arrive with music or thunder. It came in the hush of a forest clearing, in the flicker of light through high branches. Tiresias was walking alone, no company, no quest, just step on a soft path and a mind tuned to the sounds of nature. Anthon, he saw them, two snakes twisting in the grass. Some say they were fighting, others say they were mating. Myth doesn't always distinguish between violence and intimacy, especially not when it comes to snakes. Perhaps Tiresias saw in there dance something unsettling, or perhaps he simply thought he was breaking up a quarrel. Whatever the reason, he raised his staff and struck, and the world changed. In a breath, his form shifted, his balance changed, his strength moved inward. He looked down and realized he no longer recognized his own body. He had been turned into a woman, not merely a man in disguise, not half this or half that, entirely wholly changed, as though he had always been her, and with no explanation, no divine voice, no echo from the sky, Tiresias stepped forward into a new life. What followed was not madness. It was simply life. For 7 years, he lived as a woman. He worked, he moved through cities and marketplaces. He gathered water, wove cloth, perhaps even taught. Some say she married, some say she gave birth to a child. Some say she remained alone but curious always. What is certain is this: she remembered. She remembered what it meant to be seen, not as a prophet or a man, but as a woman, with all the unspoken expectations that came with that. She noticed how Thule shaped its attention, how authority changed based on voice, how touch meant something different when offered and when taken. She noticed softness in some things, hardness in others. She learned and she stored that knowledge. 7 years. Then one day, as if pulled by a thread, Tiresias returned to the woods to Thatsum clearing, and there again were the snakes, still entangled, or perhaps their descendants. It hardly matters in myth. What matters is the act. This time she did not strike. She let them be, or in some versions gently separated them, and once again transformation. Tiresias became a man again, but not Thesa man. There is something quietly astonishing about the person who has lived life as both woman and man. Not imagined it, not dressed as it, but been it fully. Who knows not just how it feels to be one, but how others behave toward you because of it. The difference between being the subject of attention and the object of it, between being listened to and being heard. That knowledge once gathered never leaves, and it did not leave Tiresias. He carried it like a stone in his pocket, not heavy, but always there. And it might have ended there. A private history, a mystery known only to one. But this is a Greek myth, and the gods do not leave mysteries alone for long. Sometime later, how much later, no one says, the gods began to argue. Zeus and Hera, husband and wife, king and queen of Olympus, were locked in one of their usual disputes. Their marriage was not known for peace. This time the subject was pleasure. More specifically, who experienced more pleasure in love? Zeus claimed it was women. 10 times more, he said. Hera, who did not enjoy being corrected, especially by her famously unfaithful husband, insisted it was men. They bickered, they raged, and finally someone remembered Tiresias. He had been both, would know, and so he was summoned, not asked. Summoned. The gods rarely ask anything, and there, in their presence, he was given the question. No leading, no context, just who experiences more pleasure in love, man or woman. He did not flinch. He said, of 10 parts, woman enjoys 9. Zeus smiled victorious. Hera did not, and just like that, in a flash of divine impulse, she struck Tiresias blind. There was no warning, no trial, just darkness. Tiresias stood still. There was no scream, no begging. He simply lowered his head. But Zeus, who had gotten the answer he wanted, felt a flicker of remorse, or perhaps in a rare moment, justice. And since the blindness could not be undone, even the gods are bound by some laws, he offered a gift instead. Prophecy. He touched Tiresias and opened his inner sight. From that day forward, the blind man could see what others could not. The future, the paths of fate, the shape of what would come. He could no longer see the color of the sky, but he could see the ending of kings, the downfall of cities, the truth that people ran from. And so Tiresias became a prophet. Not a loud one, not dramatic, just certain. He appears in many stories. After this, often in Thebes, often saying things no one wants to hear. He tells Oedipus that he is not who he thinks he is, and is accused of madness. He tells Creon to spare Antigone and is ignored. Again and again, Sisyphus like a shadow, uninvited, unwavering. He speaks truth not because he wants to, but because he must, and that too is a kind of punishment. To always know, to always be right, and to watch the world choose the wrong path anyway. Prophesying Greek myth is not power, it is sorrow, and Tiresias carries it with quiet grace. He is not bitter, not boastful. He listens more than he speaks. He walks slowly. He holds his staff gently, tapping the ground ahead of him. He smells the air. He hears everything. There is wisdom in blindness, not romanticized, just real. The kind that comes when your eyes are no longer distracted by surfaces, and all that's left is sound and pattern and intuition. The Greeks did not pity him. They respected him. They made him the one who saw what others could not bear to see. And because of that, he is always alone, never worshipped, never adored, just remembered. His punishment is not the blindness, it is being believed only too late. Even Odysseus, the most cunning of heroes, must descend into the underworld just to hear Tiresias' voice. Not because Tiresias demands it, but because in the end, all roads lead to him. The blind man in the dark still whispering truth. Let your thoughts slow now. Imagine him walking a quiet path. Thieves far behind him, the future still unwritten ahead. He touches the earth with his staff gently. He knows where the cracks are. He knows where the stones give way. He does. The world moves around him, and he walks through it like a song almost forgotten. No punishment left now, only understanding. Let that calm settle over you. The gods are silent. The city sleeps. Tiresias dreams not of what was, not of what will be, but of what is. The stillness between questions, the moment just before the truth. And you too, Arielode, to rest now. No riddles, no prophecy, just sleep. Greek mythology does not have saints. It has survivors. It has cautionary tales. It has mortals and gods locked in an endless waltz of power, desire, and delicate negotiation. It also has punishments. So many punishments doled out, not always in proportion to crime, but often in proportion to disobedience, or pride, or merely catching the attention of someone in Olympus on the wrong day. The stories we've explored of Prometheus, Sisyphus, Tantalus, Pentheus, Tiresias, and others are not merely fables. They are windows into how the Greeks understood their world. Their gods were not always just, but they were reflective. Divine punishment was not always about evil. More often, it was about overreach, hubris, stepping beyond one's place. Let's take a slow walk through the lessons. Start with Prometheus, the clever titan who gave humanity fire, the divine spark, knowledge, civilization. And for this he was chained to a rock and fed upon by an eagle for eternity. What? Because he gave humans something without permission. Because he defied Zeus. Because he acted not with cruelty but with autonomy. He chose to help mortals, and he did it not through force but wit. In the Greek imagination, Prometheus was not wrong, but he was bold, and boldness to the gods was often indistinguishable from rebellion. Punishment then became not just retribution, but a reminder. Knowledge has a cost. Every leap forward comes with a price. Prometheus lit the torch, but he paid in pain. Then there's Sisyphus, trickster, escape artist, charmer, a man so clever he cheated us more than once, but cleverness in myth only takes you so far. Sisyphus was condemned to roll a boulder uphill forever, only to watch it roll back down each time. His sin, not murder, not betrayal, but defiance. He refused to die when it was his time. He outwitted the gods, laughed in their faces, tricked Hades, delayed his own funeral, and the punishment wasn't death, it was futility. A brilliant mind condemned to meaningless repetition. It wasn't about pain, it was about frustration. The Greeks, ever philosophical, understood this well. The worst fate is not agony, it's purpose. Denied effort without reward, motion without meaning. Tantalus suffers a punishment that mirrors his crime. He fed the gods a stew made from his own son, a test, a dare, a mockery of their all, no in divinity. And so he was placed in a pool of water with food just out of reach, eternally hungry, eternally thirsty, but never satisfied. To tempt the gods was to be tempted forever. His punishment was not violent, it was poetic. That's the theme you'll notice again and again. Punishment in Greek myth is often symbol made flesh. Niobe, who bragged about her many children, was left weeping over their graves. Her tears flowed so long she became stone. Acton, who saw Artemis bathing, was turned into a stag and torn apart by his own dogs. He became the hunted Thynverse of his identity. Arachne, who dared to challenge Athena in a weaving contest and won, was turned into a spider. Still weaving, always weaving, but never as a woman again. There's a certain theatrical elegance to it. The gods were many things, but they were not imaginative in mercy, they were imaginative in irony. They turned character traits into cages, and for the Greeks, this made sense of us. These myths were not meant to be instruction manuals. They were meant to explain the tension between human limitation and divine expectation, between freedom and fate. They were mirrors held up to the uncomfortably that life is often unjust, that suffering doesn't always match sin, and that power, when eternal, does not necessarily grow kind. But, and this is important, not all punishment was vengeance, sometimes it was transformation. Tiresias, after all, was not punished in the usual sense. He was changed, blinded, yes, but gifted with prophecy, given insight few could bear. Dionys didn't crush Pentheus with a thunderbolt. He let him destroy himself through curiosity, through denial, through trying to observe what should have been honored. And some mortals who suffered did so not because they were evil, but because they stepped into a space the gods felt was theirs, alone. Take Icarus, who flew too close to Theseus and his wings melted. He fell not because he committed a crime, but because he forgot that the sky is not ours. Greek mythology is filled with these moments, quiet reminders that the gods are not always cruel, but they are always watching, and they do not like being challenged, even when they are wrong. Nowhere is this more clearly shown than in the tale of Arachne, mortal woman, brilliant weaver, no crime beyond pride. She created a tapestry showing the gods' flaws, their mistakes, their indiscretions, and it was beautiful. So beautiful, in fact, that even Athena, the goddess of wisdom and craft, could not deny its brilliance. But gods do not like mirrors, so Arachne was turned into a spider. Some say it was punishment, others say it was mercy, allowing her to continue weaving forever. That's the strange thing about Greek myth. Every punishment is a question. Is it justice? Is it cruelty? Is it evolution? Let's not forget Orpheus. He descended into the underworld, not for power, not for glory, but for love. He almost succeeded in bringing Eurydice back, but at the last moment he turned around, looked, and she vanished. Was it punishment or a lesson? Don't look back. Or maybe some things cannot be undone. Or maybe trust is a fragile thread and the gods are very still when they watch it snap. So many punishments in Greek myth are like this. Less about teaching a lesson and more about preserving a story. They do not try to explain away suffering. They say instead this happened because gods are gods, because mortals are mortals, and sometimes because someone dared to ask for more. We often think of myths as belonging to the past, as old things, dusty and brittle. But these stories gone too, because they reflect parts of us that never change. Pride, curiosity, boldness, fear, the desire to know more than we're supposed to, the need to love, to climb, to reach, and the consequences that come with that. In Greek culture, there was a word for this: hubris, overstepping one's mortal place, daring to claim too much. The gods didn't punish evil, they punished hubris. To be too good, too confident, too clever. The punishment for hubris was not always immediate. Sometimes it came through fate, sometimes through children or grandchildren, sometimes through the slow unraveling of everything a person had built. But it came, that was the lesson. Or perhaps the warning. And yet the Greeks did not despair. They wrote these stories not to make people cower, but to understand. Why does lightning strike? Because Zeus is angry. Why does the harvest fail? Because Demeter mourns. Why do the brave fall? Because courage does not protect against prophecy. The punishments of the gods are not tidy, but they are consistent. They remind us that life has weight, that choices echo, and that sometimes even the most beautiful effort can end in silence. And still we climb, still we sk, still we love. Because to be human in a Greek myth is not to be perfect. It is to try, even knowing the cost. And that perhaps is why these stories sender, they do not ask us to be saints, only to be aware, to know that the gods may be watching, and to act anyway. Let your thoughts settle now. The thunder is distant. The gods have retreated to Olympus. The mortals lie sleeping, their stones, their altars, their broken oaths, quiet now. Somewhere a boulder rolls down a hill, somewhere a prophet stirs in the dark, but you are to rest. No riddles, no fate, no punishment, only breath, and the soft unending hush of myth. Good night. Let us begin not with thunder or prophecy, but with a girl and her loom. She was called Arachne, a mortal with hands so deft they moved like wind through wool. Her tapestries shimmered with color and precision, seen so finely woven they seemed to breathe. People said she must have learned from Athena herself, which was the sort of praise one should never utter too loudly in ancient Greece. Arachne didn't deny it. In fact, she laughed. She said she was better, and that, you see, was a mistake. But the gods of Olympus were not distant noble deities. They were near, always near, and they didn't particularly like being compared to mortals, let alone outdone by them. So Athena came down from the heavens, her pride pricked like a burr under the skin, and challenged the girl to a contest. 2 looms, 2 minds, one Adivan, one human in Arachne's tapestry. It was exquisite, a panorama of the gods' misdeeds. Zeus seducing women in a dozen disguises, Poseidon ravishing Medusa in Athena's temple, Apollo chasing nymphs who wanted nothing to do with him. The thread glittered with uncomfortable truth. Athena's work, by contrast, was floss and stern, a depiction of piety and punishment. But when she saw Arachne's piece, she flew into a rage, not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't. She tore it apart and struck the girl down. Then, in that strangely poetic cruelty the god so loved, transformed her into a spider. And so Arachne still weaves, but without fingers, without pride, without a voice. A cautionary tale, and one that sets the tone. Because in Greek mythology, if a god notices you, it rarely ends well. The Olympians, you see, were not above meddling. They did not dwell on high with benevolent detachment. Number they peered down, eyes sharp, ashocks looking for beauty, arrogance, wit, or defiance, anything that might amuse or annoy them. Humans were their toys, their distractions, their cautionary examples. Take Semele, a mortal woman, beloved of Zeus. He whispered sweet nothings into her ear and promised her anything she wished, and in a moment of fatal honesty, she asked to see him as Heterally was, in all his divine radiance. Zeus warned her, he begged her to walk inside her, but an oath was an oath, and when he revealed his true form, the brightness alone consumed her, burned to ash. Their unborn child, Dionysus, was savagely because Zeus sewed him into his own thigh. Like a strange botanical graft heart, he was born later with a head full of vines and madness. Another mortal Io suffered a different fate. She caught Zeus's eye, an unfortunate habit of many young women in mythology to conceal her from higher. Zeus turned her into a cow, a lovely cow, Tobe fair. But still, Hea never wanted to be fooled for long, demanded the cow Ace a gift, and assigned Argus, the giant with 100 eyes, to guard her. And so I wandered, watched always, pursued by a gadfly Hera sent to torment her. She crossed countenance, became a legend. Eventually she was restored to human form, but not before learning that divine attention was a form of punishment in itself. Even mortals who never sought glory often found themselves dragged into Thegod's schemes. Cassandra was one such soul. She was given the gift of prophecy by Apollo in exchange for her love. But when she changed her mind, as people do, Apollo did not take rejection well. He cursed her. She would still speak true prophecies, but no one would ever believe her. She saw the fall of Troy. She saw her own death. She saw fire and ruin, and no one listened, not once. The Greeks had a word for this kind of tragic arrogance, hubris. It wasn't just pride, it was overstepping, crossing invisible lines drawn by gods who did not like their creations to become too clever, too bold, or too bountiful. Mortals who rose too high were always brought low, not always with death, but sometimes with something worse. Take Niobe, queen of Thebes. She had many children, 12 in some stories, 14 in others, and she made the mistake of bragging that she was more deserving of worship than Leto, who had only 2. Unfortunately for Niobe, Leto's 2 children were Artemis and Apollo. They descended like arrows from the sky. One by one Niobe's children fell. She wept and screamed and begged. In the end, the gods turned her tossed in a weeping rock carved by grief. And somewhere in Anatolia, the stone still stands. Mortals could rarely win, and when they did, it often came with strings like poor Phaethon, who demanded proof that the sun god Helios was his father. Helios, bound by paternal pride and perhaps a touch of guilt, allowed him to drive the chariot of the sun for a day. A teenage boy at the reins of a flaming, sky-burning, day-dragging chariot. It did not go well. He lost control. The sun veered too close to the earth. Fields scorched, rivers boiled. The world began to unravel. Zeus, ever the cosmic janitor, hurled a lightning bolt and ended it. Phaethon fell like a star and crashed into the river. Erdogonus mortals grieved. The gods moved on. Even the great wars of mortals were often started by divine pettiness. The Trojan War, for instance, did not begin with ships or sieges. It began with the golden apple. Eris, goddess of discord, wasn't invited to a divine wedding, so she did what any resentful guest might. She tossed a golden apple into a feast inscribed with the words to the fairest. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, all rigid deferent. They demanded a judge, and they found one in Paris, a Trojan prince tending sheep far from the noise of court. Each goddess offered him a gift. Hera offered power. Athena offered wisdom and victory in battle. Aphrodite offered the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. He chose beauty. He chose Aphrodite. And that woman, Helen, was already married to a Spartan king. When Paris took her to Troy, the world ignited. 1,000 ships launched. Heroes died. Cities burned. All because of one mortal asked to judge a divine beauty pageant. It should be said no good ever came of mortals trying to decide which god was better. The gods didn't want truth. They wanted flattery. But mortals could not avoid them. Not really. They prayed. They sacrificed. They lit fires and poured wine and whispered names before sleep. The temples were many. And the gods weary very were not always listening but always present. And the relationship was not about love. It was about survival. To be immortal was to walk carefully, to give thanks quickly, to take no credit even for your own genius, to hope above all to be overlooked, because to be noticed by the gods was to become a story. And in Greek mythology, stories rarely ended well. The gods did not weep for mortals. They used them sometimes. They gave gifts. Yes, a golden touch here, a prophecy there, but their gifts often turned sour. Midas wished for everything he touched to turn to gold, and soon he could touch nothing, not bread, not water, not his daughter. He begged for the gift, to be taken back. It was, but not before he learned that divine generosity always has a price. Some mortals try to outwit fate, but fate was older than the gods. The Moira, the Fates, spun, measured, and cut the threads of life. Even Zeus could not undo what they. Oedipus tried, told he would kill his father and marry his mother. He fled the home he knew, and in doing so fulfilled the prophecy. The very effort to escape his doom brought it into being. That was the cruel beauty of Greek myth. No one was above fate. Not kings, not queens, not heroes, and certainly not mortals. So why, one might wonder, did people keep believing in these gods? Why pray to deities who punished more than? Because the gods explained the world, the storms, the floods, the sudden illnesses, the way fortunes rose and fell. All of it could be seen in thestories. The gods gave shape to chaos. They made meaning from suffering. They were not just punished, they were metaphors, archetypes, warnings in flesh. And for all their flaws, they were unforgettable. To be immortal in Greek mythology was to be temporary, a momentary flash of joy or error, a name in a line of verse, a thread in the great tapestry of fate, sometimes brilliant, often bloodstained, always fragile, and somewhere above or beyond the gods watched, amused, displeased, or merely curious, and you, little mortal, you simply did your best to survive the story. It's one thing to make a mistake and suffer for it, but imagine being doomed not because of what you did, but because of what your great-great-grandfather once said to a god, possibly while drunk and possibly while losing at dice. In the world of Greek mythology, curses were not simply misfortunes. They were legacy items, heirlooms passed down with the familiar name. You could inherit your father's nose, your mother's eyes, and a divinable addiction that would ruin your entire bloodline for generations. It made for a dramatic family tree, heavy on nobility, light on happy endings. Consider, for example, the House of Atros, a dynasty so steeped in doom that it makes the average soap opera look like a church picnic. The trouble began, as it so often does, with a quarrel between brothers. Atros and Thyestes, sons of Pelops, squabbled over the meat. There was betrayal, adultery, and then inevitably cannibalism. Atreus, having discovered that his brother had an affair with his wife, decided the appropriate response was to serve him a feast of his own children, artfully roasted. Now, you might assume the gods would intervene here, smite someone, send a memo, but no. The gods simply nodded grimly and let the curse settle in like a stain. From that moment on, the family was doomed. Atros' son, Agamemnon, went on to become the commander of the Greek forces in the Trojan War, a great honor. He also sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to get a favorable wind, spent 10 years at war, and was murdered in Hisbath upon returning home by his wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover. His surviving children then had to decide whether avenging their father was more important than not murdering their mother. A difficult position even by mythological standards. Orestes the son chose vengeance. He killed Clytemnestra and was promptly hounded across the land by the Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance with snakes for hair and a passion for justice that did not forgive Metrade. Only with divine intervention and a trial at the Areopagus in Athens was Orestes finally acquitted, but even then the stain lingered. House of Atros was the cautionary tale of cautionary tales, a bloodline cursed with betrayal, madness, and murder, not because each generation was evil, but because the weight of divine wrath could not be shaken off like old dust. And it wasn't just royal families who suffered this fate. Take Oedipus, poor unfortunate Oedipus, born to Laius and Jocasta. Of thieves, Laius, like many mythical men, made a mistake. He abducted a young man, violating hospitality and sacred law. The gods frowned upon this and a curse was laid. The prophecy came: their child will kill his father and marry his mother. Naturally, they did what any responsible parents might do. They tried to have the baby killed, but the servant they tasked with the job couldn't quite bring himself to do it. He left the child to die on a hillside instead. A shepherd found him. The boy was raised in Corinth, unaware of his origins. Years later, Oedipus, now a young man, heard a whisper of prophecy himself, that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified, he fled Corinth, trying to outrun destiny. But you can't outpace the fates. He met Laius on the road. There was an argument, as ancient fathers and sons are wont to have. A fight broke out. One man died. Later, Oedipus married Jocasta, queen of thieves, and had children. The truth came slowly, horribly. Jocasta hanged herself. Oedipus blinded himself, and their children, Antigone and her siblings, would inherit not just a ruined throne, but a family history thick with sorrow. Greek tragedy, you see, doesn't bother with happy endings. It begins with the seed of ruin and to watch as it grow. This idea that a family line could be cursed wasn't just poetic fiction. The Greeks believed in something called miasma, a kind of spiritual pollution. It could be inherited. You could be born unclean because of the sins of your ancestors. Blood cries out for more blood. And until the cycle is broken through sacrifice, exile, or divine mercy, it continues. We might see it as metaphor today. Generational trauma, the sins of the father. But for the Greeks, it was very literal, a spiritual rot that clung to a name not unlike mildew on stone. You could change your clothes, your city, even your gods, but the curse remains. And so we find mortals who live in fear, not of what they might do, but what they are, who they are. Perseus, hero and slayer of Medusa, was himself born of questionably serpent. His mother, Dawn, was locked in a bronze chamber by her father, who had heard a prophecy that her child would kill him. Zeus, never only to let bronze get in the way of romance, visited her in the form of golden rain, one of the strangest seduction tactics in myth. Dia conceived, Perseus was born. The king Argus did not kill the child, but set mother and son adrift at sea. They survived. Perseus thrived. Years later he returned and entirely by accident struck his grandfather dead with a discus at some friendly games. Fate fulfilled. Even when no one meant any harm, prophecy finds its loopholes. These stories reflect something deep in the Greek psyche, the idea that fate isn't that something you can bargain with. It is a web already woven, and every step you take simply tangles you further. Mortals tried to be clever. They tried to outthink destiny, but the gods always smiled quietly and let them try. Sometimes the curse was physical. The line of Cadmus, founder of Thebes, was riddled with misfortune. His descendants included Pentheus, torn apart by his own mother in a frenzy of Dionysian madness, and Acton, who accidentally saw Artemis bathing and was transformed into a stag, then hunted and killed by his own hounds. Cadmus himself, after a life of toil and tragedy, was turned into his wife too. They slithered off into obscurity. Perhaps the kindest ending in entire family history. But not all cursed families were royal. Some were simply too beautiful for their own good. Take the tale of Phaedra, wife of Theseus. Her stepson, Hippolytus, was a devout follower of Artemis. So devout, in fact, that he shunned Olive and scorned Aphrodite. And you can imagine how well that went. Aphrodite, goddess of love and vengeance, arranged for Phaedra to fall in love with him. It was unnatural, tragic. When he rejected her, she took her own life and left a note claiming he had attacked her. Theseus cursed his son, and Poseidon, never one to pass up a smiting, obliged Hippolytus died, dashed against the rocks by his own chariot horses. You could die because your family was cursed, or because God wanted revenge on Samaean. You reminded them of, or simply because you existed in the orbit of doomed people. Misery was contagious. The Greeks didn't believe in fairness, not in the modern sense. They believed in moira, one's share, one's portion of fate. Some were given great glory, others were given ruin, sometimes both. But what about redemption, you might ask? What about mortals who escaped the curse? They're rare, but not impossible. Orestes, hounded by the Furies, eventually received a trial in Athens. The jury was split, half for acquittal, half for condemnation. Athena herself cast a deciding vote, not in the name of justice, but mercy. And in that moment, a new idea emerged, that law might one day replace vengeance, that perhaps a man need not be defined solely by his ancestors' crimes. It was a glimmer of hope, a small one, but there it was. In the meantime, the average mortal lived quietly, married carefully, prayed constantly, one eye on the gods, one foot in the dirt, hoping the sins of the father had not already taken root in the son. To be immortal in Greek mythology was to live in a story that began long before you were born and might not end until long after you were gone. Your life was a single verse in a tragic poem shaped by bloodlines, curses, and the unpredictable whims of fate. You might rise, you might fall, but Yah would not escape the weight of your name. And if the gods whispered your family's name in Olympus, whether in praise or in jest, that was rarely a good sign. There are many lessons to learn from Greek mythology, but one stands above the rest. Carved like a warning into thievery foundations of Mount Olympus. Do not talk back to the gods. Don't question them. Don't correct them. Don't get clever, sarcastic, or poetic. Don't mutter under your breath. Don't sigh too loudly. And above all, do not under any circumstances try to win an argument, because they will hear you. They always do. And while gods may be immortal, their egos are supremely liberal. Take the case of Pentheus, king of Thebes. Young, proud, fond of order. He ruled with a sharp eye and a firm hand. And then Dionysus arrived. Now, Dionysus was not your typical Olympian. Born of a mortal mother, Semele, and carried in Zeus's thigh, he straddled the line between divine and human, wild and civilized, wine and wrath. His worship was strange, ecstatic, dancing in the woods, drinking, shouting, shedding inhibition like a snake's skin. Pentheus, unimpressed, declared it nonsense. He bonned Dionysian rites, arrested the god in disguise, mocked his long hair, and in the sort of fatal decision only a tragic character could make, decided to spy on the back women and their rebels. Dressed as one off, he crept into the forest in a flowing gown, perched in a tree for a better view. And there, in the moonlight, the women saw him, but they did not see a man. Dionysus clouded their minds. They saw a lion. They attacked his own mother. Agave was first to reach him. She tore him down. He died in pieces, smiling up at the stars. The gods are nothing if not theatrical. Pentheus's crime. He laughed. He doubted. He told the gods they were nonsense. And the gods, it turns out, have the opinion on nonsense. Another fellow who learned this the hard way was Copernicus, a warrior in the myth of the Seven against Thebes. He scaled the city walls bold as brass and declared aloud in the middle of battle that not even Zeus could stop him. Zeus did stop him with a lightning bolt. Instant death crisped mid-sentence. There's a curious silence that follows stories like these. A kind of collective holding of breath, because the moral is never subtle. Speak out of turn and Yao will be turned to ash or stone or mist or a cautionary statue in some temple. Even those who told the truth, not lies but inconvenient truths, were punished. Cassandra, princess of Troy, was given the gift of prophecy by Apollo, but when she rejected his advances, or rather accepted the gift and then rejected him, he cursed her. She would still see the future. Yes, she would see it clearly, brilliantly, unbearably, but no one would ever believe her. She warned of the Trojan horse, of the Sisyphus, the city of her own death, and every word fell like dust, disbelieved, ignored, dismissed. The gods, you see, don't mind if you are right as long as it's flattering. If it's not, well, you'll find yourself feeling into the void. And sometimes the punishment came not from the god directly but through the very forces of fate itself. Take Arachne, you'll remember her from earlier, the weaver who dared claim she was better than Athena. The detail often overlooked in her story is this: she was right. Her tapestry was beautiful, it told the truth. It depicted the gods' crimes, their disguises, their seductions, and Athena, though furious, could not deny the skill. So she destroyed Thuwork and the girl. Because it is not enough. To be right you must also be reverent. And in ancient Greece, reverence did not mean quiet belief, it meant submission. It's easy to judge the gods as petty. And to be fair, they often were. But her responses reflect something deeper about the way the Greeks saw the world. The gods were not moral exemplars. They were not just or fair in the way we use those terms now. They were powerful, and that in the ancient world was theonly justice that mattered. Power could not be questioned without consequence. The gods represented not ideals but forces. The sea was Poseidon, stormy, unpredictable, capable of bounty or destruction. Wisdom was Athena, cold, strategic, sometimes cruel. Love was Aphrodite, capricious, overwhelming, delightful. Narration. To insult a god was to insult the very fabric of the world. To question Artemis was to court death in childbirth. To laugh at Dieta was to risk famine, and the gods did not need to punish you personally. Sometimes they let your own words do the damage. Consider Niobe again, the queen who bragged about her many children, mocking Leto for having only 2. It was not just pride, it was speech. She voiced disrespect. She put it into the world, and so Leto's children, Apollo and Artemis, struck her family down one by one. When the last child died, Niobe fled to a mountaintop and begged the gods to end her suffering. They granted her request, turned her to stone. Even her tears, they say, became part of the mountain, always weeping, never changing. It's tempting to imagine these stories as metaphors, cautionary tales for courtly behavior, but in ancient Greece they were lived truths. Not literal, perhaps, but deeply embedded in ritual and thought. People didn't just fear the gods, they feared saying the wrong thing near a shrine, making a joke during a sacrifice, yawning too loudly during a festival. Speech was power, and power could summon attention, and attention, divine attention, was rarely a blessing. The Greek term phorthos was asa, impiety. It didn't mean heresy in the modern sense. It meant acting improperly toward the divine, speaking out of turn, behaving without the right reverence. Socrates, the philosopher, was executed not for atheism, but for asbaya, corrupting the youth, introducing new gods and failing to honor the old ones. The gods did not require you to love them, but they demanded respect. The curious thing is that gods themselves viscerally held to the same standard. Zeus was a serial adulterer. Hea was vengeful beyond reason. Poseidon flooded cities in fits of pique. Apollo flayed a man alive for losing a music contest. And yet to question their actions was to invite ruin. It was a divine paradox. You expected to worship beings whose flaws were legendary, and you had to do it with sincerity. And so the average mortal developed a very pragmatic relationship with religion. You honored the gods because it was safer that way. You made offerings. You said your prayers. You did not boast. You did not challenge. And if the gods smiled on you, wonderful. And if they didn't, you assumed you defended them somehow and tried harder. There's a quiet desperation in that, a sort of cosmic appeasement, a reminder that in a world ruled by immortals with bad tempers, the only real power mortals had was silence. Which brings us to another kind of punishment. Not dramatic, not fiery, not sudden, but slow, oblivion. The Greeks believed in Clio's glory, theckened, that lives on in stories. But if you defied the gods in some quiet, unseen way, you might not be struck down. You might simply be forgotten. No songs, no statues, no name carved into stone. To be remembered was its own kind of immortality. To be erased was the cruelest fate of all. That perhaps is why so many Greek mortals died dramatically. They weren't just unlucky. To live quietly was safe, but it meant no glory, no legacy. And so mortals danced along a razor's edge, seeking renown but fearing gods, wanting to be known but not cursed, wanting most of all to speak their truth without being struck by lightning. But the gods were always listening, even when they pretended not to be, especially then. And so, dear listener, if you ever find yourself wandering the paths of ancient Greece, under a fig tree or beside a bubbling spring, and you feel tempted to complain aloud about your lot in life, perhaps wait until you're well out of earshot, because one of them might be listening, and one of them might be bored, and mortals who talk back tend not to talk long. You're walking along a dusty road. There's a cool breeze, the scent of thyme and olive in the air, and the sound of distant goats. All is calm, all is ordinary. And then suddenly, a creature the size of a house steps out from behind a rock and decides you look like lunch. Welcome to a fairly typical Tuesday in ancient Greek mythology. For mortals, the world was never just fields and sky. It was also layers, caves, cliffs, forests thick with teeth and scales. You never quite knew what might be lurking behind the next olive tree, a shepherd, a satyr, or a three-headed dog. The Greeks were particularly fond of monsters, not in the way modern stories might treat them. Misunderstood, sympathetic, tragic. No, their monsters were, generally speaking, quite content being horrible. They didn't need complex motivations, they just needed appetites, and unfortunately mortals were often the preferred dish. Let us begin with one of the greats, the chimera, not just stone beasts, but three. A lion in the front, a goat sprouting from its back, and a snake for a tail. It breathed fire, of course, because why not? Its purpose in life appeared to be to roam the countryside, burning livestock and incinerating anyone with a torch and a sword who thought they might make annam for themselves. Heroic, yes, but also flammable. Then there's Scylla, poor sailors. They thought the worst part of their journey was the open sea, the storms, the pirates, the hunger. But then they reached the straits, narrow and perilous. On one side a whirlpool, named Charybdis, which could suck down entire ships like a drunkard draining a wineskin. And on the other, Scylla, a rock-dwelling horror with 12 legs, 6 heads, and a fondness for plucking sailors off decks like there was no safe route. If you steered away from one, you veered too close to the other. And in life, as in myth, some choices are not about winning. They're about minimizing how much of your crew you lose. Or take the Minna, half man, half bull, raised in a labyrinth so complex that even its builder barely escaped. This monster was the result of a long and unfortunate chain of divine meddling and royal bad judgment. A queen enchanted to fall in love with a bull, an architect with too much imagination, and a child born of that union, imprisoned forever in darkness. The Athenians, having displeased King Minos of Crete, were forced to send 7 young men and 7 maidens every 9 years as tribute to be released into the labyrinth. None returned until, of course, Theseus came along with his ball-off string and healthy levels of self-confidence. But for decades before that, the Minotaur simply ate. That was the thing about monsters in Greek mythology. They weren't just dangers. They were reminders, symbols, warnings, perhaps that the world wasn't made for human comfort. That out there in the deep places, the gods had let chaos roam free. And mortals were often the price paid for order. The Sphinx perched outside. Thieves was another such price. She asked riddles. If you answered incorrectly, she killed you. For weeks, months, perhaps even years, travelers passed, tried, failed, died, until Oedipus, clever doomed Oedipus, came along and answered her question correctly. The Sphinx leapt from her perch and perished, which sounds like a Victoria. Remember that this was only the beginning of Oedipus' troubles. Solving one monster's riddle only led him deeper into the riddle of his own blood. These creatures weren't all created equal either. Some were born of primordial forces like Typhon, a storm demon so massive and terrible that the gods themselves fled Olympus when he rose. Others were spawned by Echidna, the mother of all monsters, who seemed to have a very productive relationship with Typhon, birthing Hydra, Cerberus, and a host of other delightful creatures best admired from a distance. Hydra, for instance, was a serpent with multiple heads. When you cut one off, 2 more grew in its place. A handy metaphor really for problems that get worse the more you meddle. Or in the case of Heracles, just another day's work. Heracles, the closest thing Greek mythology has to a full-time monster exterminator, spent his life dealing with the gods' unfinished business. Giant bow, man-eating birds, hellhounds, all sent his way, usually as part of a labor assigned by a cowardly king or an angry god. One gets the sense that the Olympians didn't like clearing up their messes. They just created monsters, then waited for some sweaty mortal with a club to solve the problem. And when he did, they might grant him a reef or more likely send him another one. Even beautiful creatures could be deadly. The sirens, for instance, sat on craggy rocks by the sea, singing songs so sweet that sailors forgot themselves, forgot food, sleep, wives, children, everything. They steered toward the sound, dashed their ships on the rocks, and died smiling. Odysseus, clever man that he was, stuffed his crew's ears with wax and teed himself to the mast just to hear their song without being lured. A rare case of a man encountering a monster and surviving with his life and ego intact. More often, mortals stumbled upon danger with no warning. A flash of feathers, a shadow in the sky, a hiss from a cave. The ancient Greek countryside in myth was riddled with hazards, not just beasts but divine punishments given form. And yet, despite all this, monsters were necessary. They gave heroes something to fight. They shaped stories into arcs, from fear to confrontation to sometimes triumph. But for the ordinary mortal, the non-hero, the farmer or fisher or child caught in the crossfire, They were simply a reminder that the world was not safe. Imagine living in a time where no explanation existed for earthquakes or droughts, where disease had no clear cause, where lightning struck without warning. The world must have seemed full of unseen forces. And so the Greeks filled that uncertainty with teeth and wings and claws. But monsters were not just symbols of nature. They were also warnings about behavior. Take Medusa. She began in some versions as a beautiful maiden, but after her in Athena's temple, the goddess punished her, not Poseidon, by turning her into a gorgon, snake hair, petrifying gaze, solitude, eternal. What was she really? A monster or a woman transformed by divine wrath into something others should fear? Perhaps both. The Greeks understood that monsters were not just born, they were made. Often they were mortals first, changed by curses, by jealousy, by vengeance. The line between human and beast was always thin. Lycaon, for example, was a king who served Zeushuman flesh disguised as hospitality. In return, he was turned into a wolf, an early werewolf tale if you like, but also a message. Offend the gods and you might lose more than your manners. Even lovers of gods could become monsters. Take Limea, once a queen of Libya, beloved by Zeus. Hera naturally took offense. As punishment, Limea's children were slain. Grief drove her mad. Hera then added a cruel twist. Limea was cursed never to sleep and to devour the children of others. She became a night-stalking demon, feared in lullabies, but beneath the horror was sorrow. Her monstrousness was not her fault, it was her sentence. In this way, monsters in Greek myth were often tragic, not in a soft modern sense, but in the hard classical sense of the word. They suffered, they frightened, they died, but they were never senseless. They may in something. Even Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades, had his. He stood at the gates of the underworld, let souls in, did not let him out. A monster, yes, but also a guardian, a cosmic border collie obsess. And so mortals lived with monsters, not just in story, but in worldview. They were the teeth in the darkness, the consequences of divinal or human folly, or simply the old world not yet tamed. No mortal could kill them all. No city could be safe forever. But they endured. They built temples to gods who might keep monsters away. They passed down tales, how to defeat them, how to avoid them, how to live with knowledge that they might always be nearby. For some, monsters were an invitation, a chance to rise, to become a hero, to carve their name in the annals of myth. For others, they were just bad luck, a wrong turn, a scream in the night. And for most, they were simply a reminder of that the world was not made for their comfort. It was a place of beauty, yes, but also of wings in the sky, scales beneath the waves, eyes in the dark. And when the gods were bored or careless or cruel, they let the monsters roam free. There's a strange thing about Greek heroes. They shine like stars in poetry, cast in bronze, immortalized in epic. Their names echo through the centuries. Achilles, Heracles, Jason, Odysseus. But if you pause a moment and really look at their stories, not the glory, but the lives themselves, you might begin to wonder, was it worth it? Because to be a hero in Greek mythology was to be famous, yes, but also to be hunted, cursed, betrayed, punished, exiled, tormented by the gods, and without fail to die tragically. You were heroic, but you were disposable. Let's begin with the most obvious case, Achilles, the poster boy of Greek heroism, stronger than all, faster than most, and blessed or cursed with a choice. Live a long quiet life in obscurity, or die young and gain eternal glory. Naturally, he chose the latter. This is Greek myth. After all, longevity was never fashionable. So he sailed for Troy, fought for 10 long years, killed Hector, dragged his body around the city walls, and then one morning was struck down by a single arrow, guided by Apollo, fired by Paris, and aimed at the one soft place on his body, the heel. It's poetic, of course, but also rather deflating. All that strength, all that wrath, and in the end, one tiny vulnerability was enough. Because heroes were never to simply age. They didn't retire. They didn't settle down and write memoirs. They didn't even get to enjoy their triumphs. They existed to die at the right moment in the right way for the right song to be sung, and the gods made sure of it. Heracles, or Hercules if you prefer the Latin form, is another fine example. A man so strong he held up the sky, cleaned the stables of Algus in a single afternoon, and strangled snakes in his cradle. But for all his power, he was never free. The 12 labors, the Sisyphus feats, were not optional, they were penance. You see, in a fit of madness sent by Hera, Heracles killed his wife and children. The punishment, service, labor, tasks so monstrous, they might as well have been death sentences. And even after completing them, he didn't get peace. His life ended in agony, poisoned by a tunic soaked in centaur blood, a gift from his second wife who had been tricked into thinking it would ensure his fidelity. He died on a pie, flames consuming the mortal half of him, the divine half ascending to Olympus. Yes, the gods welcomed him in the end, but only after they had burned him down to his bones. Then there's Jason. Handsome, charming, ambitious Jason. He assembled the finest team in mythology, the Argonauts, and sailed off to win the Golden Fleece. It was a dazzling journey, monsters, clashing rocks, enchanted lands, and of course, Medea, the brilliant, terrifying sorceress who helped him succeed, killed for him, betrayed her family for him. And what did he do when they returned? He married another woman. Medea responded as Medea does by murdering their children and leaving him broken and alone. Jason, once so glorious, died years later when a beam from his rotting ship fell and crushed him, a hero forgotten, killed not by war or rough, but by neglect and gravity. These men, lion-hearted, battle-scarred, were never truly safe, not from monsters, nor from their friends, nor even from their own choices. Their greatness didn't protect them. In fact, it often attracted the worst. Thegods were quick to take offense at mortals who gained too much glory. After all, divine attention was rarely a compliment. Ask Bellerophon. He was a proper hero, tamer of Pegasus, slayer of the Chimera, a man favored by the gods. And then one day he decided to fly Pegasus up to Olympus, not to conquer, just to visit. It did not go well. Zeus sent a gadfly to sting the horse. Bellerophon fell, survived technically, but was crippled, blind, and lived out his days wandering and hated by gods and men alike. Because the one thing a mortal must never do is try to sit at the table of the divine. That's not to say heroism was not admired. The Greeks celebrated it in song and sculpture, but there was always a sense of danger about it, a sense that to rise too high was to invite the fall, and nowhere is that clearer than in the story of Ajax, a giant among men, a warrior of unmatched strength and courage. After Achilles' death, his armor was awarded to the next greatest Greek. Ajax expected it. Odysseus received it, humiliated, maddened. Ajax plotted revenge, but Athena clouded his mind, slaughtered livestock, thinking they were his comrades. When he came to his senses, grief-stricken and dishonored, he fell on his own sword. No enemy defeated him, only shame. It's important to understand how the Greeks viewed glory, kleos as they called it. It was not just fame. It was the legacy of your deeds. What would be remembered after you were gone? What poets would sing? What statues would show? And because the afterlife was frankly rather dismal, grey fields, wandering shades, no wine to speak of, kleos was the only mortality that mattered. To be forgotten was worse than death, and sorrows chased danger, risked everything. They weren't reckless because they were desperate for meaning, for memory, for a life that would echo, and yet there's a quiet sadness to it all. Odysseus, for instance, won the war at Troy through cunning. The Trojan horse was his idea, and after the war, he spent 10 years trying to get home, battling storms, monsters, temptations, all because he had once boasted that his triumphs were his own. And Poseidon took that very personally. Even when he reached Ithaca at last, his troubles weren't over. He had to slaughter a house full of suitors, rebuild trust with his wife, reassert his kingship. It was never over. Not really, because in Greek myth, the hero never gets tourist, and when they do, it often means they're dead. Even the great Perseus, who slew Medusa and rescued Andromeda, ends not in triumph, but in obscurity. His victories made him famous, yes, but he fades from the story, settles down, vanishes from the epic stage. Glory, it seems, has an expiration date. The women of mythology, too, had their share of heroic suffering. Though less often sung by bards, their stories are no less seared by pain. Atalanta, for example, swiftest of runners, deadliest of hunters, she swore never to marry unless beaten. A foot race. Many tried, all failed until one man, Hippomenes, used golden apples from Aphrodite to distract her. He won, they married, and then, caught in a moment of passion, they made love in a sacred temple. The gods, of course, were not amused. They were turned into lions, forever circling, never resting. So many Greek heroes ended up transformed, not exalted but altered, humbled, made into animals or stars or flowers. Their stories twisted by divine hands into reminders for the rest of us. Be brave, yes, but not too brave. Be famous, yes, but not too proud. Live brightly, but do not outshine the gods. Even those who serve the gods directly could not count on safety, as Clypeus, son of Apollo, became so skilled in healing that he learned to raise the dead. A noble calling perhaps, but one that annoyed Hades. Death was, after all, part of the cosmic order. So Zeus killed him with a thunderbolt. Apollo retaliated by killing the Cyclopes who made the bolt. In turn, Zeus banished Apollo to serve as a mortal shepherd, a cascade of punishment. Even the divine could be demoted, the heroic undone. And yet, despite Althus, the danger, the madness, the inevitable fall, mortals still aspire to be heroes. They volunteered for quests, they prayed for signs, they followed omens into forests, full of fangs and fire. Because obscurity was worse, cowardice, unthinkable, a quiet life almost shameful. The Greeks didn't want safe stories, they wanted eons worth telling. And so over and over, mortals gathered themselves to the gods and the monsters and the wars and the wounds, not for peace, but for song. The bards remembered them. We remember them. They were chewed up by myth, yes, but they were not forgotten. They were heroic and they were disposable. But perhaps, just perhaps, they knew that going in love, they say, makes the world go round. But in Greek mythology it morphed and sends it spinning wildly off course, then straight into a ditch, because in the world of gods and mortals, love wasn't the soft rose-petalled notion we like to imagine today. It was far more treacherous, a force of nature, or worse, a divine weapon. It could bless, yes, but more than it ruined. And for mortals, falling in love, always being loved by a god, was one of the most dangerous things that could possibly happen. Let's begin with a cautionary tale. One of the most beautiful pagan, a sculptor from Cyprus, gifted and solitary. He carved a statue of a woman, not just beautiful but perfect. So perfect, in fact, that he fell in love with her, whispered to her, brought her gifts, dressed her in fine robes. A little odd perhaps, but harmless enough. Then he went to the temple of Aphrodite and asked, gently, reverently, for a bride like the statue. The goddess, amused or perhaps flattered, answered. The statue came to life. A happy ending, one might think. But look closer. Pagan didn't fall in love with a woman. He created one. She had no past, no family, no memories. She existed only to please him. The Greeks didn't bother to give her a name until Roman poets did centuries later. Love in this case was not a relationship. It was possession dressed in poetry. But far more often love in myth wasn't about creation. It was about punishment. Take Narcissus, a young man so stunning that people fell in love with him on sight, but he showed no interest, no affection, no kindness. One rejected soul prayed to the gods for vengeance, and they delivered it. Narcissus came to a still pool, saw his own reflection, fell in love. Unable to touch the image, unable to look away, he withered, died, and where he fell, a flower grew, delicate, pale, always bowing toward the water. The Greeks knew what we now call toxic self-regard, but they turned it into a myth, a warning, softly blooming by the riverbank. Then there's poor Echo, a nymph who talked too much. By some accounts, she used to distract Hea while Zeus conducted his usual affairs. When Hea discovered the trick, she cursed Echo so she could only repeat what others said. She met Narcissus, loved him silently, helplessly, repeated his words back to him like a plea, and when he spurned her she faded, only her voice remained. Love in Greek mythology was not a gentle bond between equals. It was more often a trap. Consider Orpheus and Eurydice, a poet, a lyre player, a man whose music would charm birds from trees, and tears from stone. When Eurydice died, bitten by a serpent on their wedding day, Orpheus did what no mortal had dared. He went to the underworld to fetch her back. He played, he pleaded, and for once the gods listened. They let her go. On one condition: he must not look back at Herental. They reached the upper world. He agreed, walked ahead, listened to her footsteps behind, but doubt crept in. What if she wasn't there? What if they tracked him? He turned, and in that instant Eurydice was gone again, this time forever. He lived on, played on, until in one version he was torn apart by Maeads, wild women of Dionysus, because he would no longer love anyone at his lost bride. Even when the love was mutual, the story rarely ended well. Take Phaedra and Hippolytus. He was handsome, chaste, devoted to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and of purity. His stepmother Phaedra was cursed by Aphrodite to fall in love with him. An impossible, shameful desire. Shephodit hid it, but eventually confessed. And when he rejected her, she took her own life, leaving a note claiming he had assaulted her. Theseus, his father, cursed him. Poseidon sent a sea monster. Apollo died, dragged by his chariot Thorsus along the rocks. Aphrodite and Artemis, the goddesses who stood behind drama, ended the tale by mourning their respective champions. Love once again proved fatal. And of course, there's the story of Paris and Helen. He was a Trojan prince. She the most beautiful, the woman enthralled and very much married. Paris awarded a golden apple to Aphrodite in a divine beauty contest, and she gave him Helen in return. It was no gentle elopement. It was an abduction, or perhaps a seduction, depending on which version. But either way, it was enough to launch 1,000 ships. The Trojan War followed 10 years of slaughter. Cities burned, heroes died, all for one woman and one ill-advised divine bribe. To love in myth was to gamble. To be loved even more so, especially if the lover was a god. Zeus, of course, was the most infamous. He appeared to mortals as a bull, a swan, a shower of gold, an eagle, a cloud. Romantic perhaps, if you ignore the implications. His lovers suffered. Semele was incinerated. Io was turned into a cow. Later bore children who hatched from eggs. Europa was carried across the sea. Dan conceived Perseus in a locked chamber. And Callisto, after being seduced or assaulted depending on the version, was turned into a bear. Her son nearly killed her. The gods finally placed them in the stars. Ursa Major and Minor, a consolation prize if ever there was one. Aphrodite herself was no gentler. When she fell in love with the mortal Anchises, she warned him not to tell anyone. He did, bragged about it, and was struck by lightning or made lame or blinded. The myths vary, but the moral does not. Even being loved by a goddess could ruin you. There's a strange logic to all of this. Love in the Greek imagination wasn't controllable. It wasn't rational. It was divine madness. Aeros, not the soft affection of Odin romance, but a kind of possession. When you were in love, you were no longer yourself. And that, in a society that prized moderation, dignity, and restraint, was deeply unsettling. The god, Eros, or Cupid as the romance later called him, was not a cherub. He was a force, a spark of chaos. To be struck by his arrows was to lose your will, your reason, your control. And mortals, bound as they were by duty and fate, could not afford to lose control. Even in history, this theme persisted. The Greeks saw love as something that could be both civilizing and destructive. Marriage was a social contract. Important, yes, sacred even. But passion, Eros, was something else. Dangerous, powerful, not to be trusted in their dramas. Love leads to downfall. In their temples, it's a force to be warped carefully, and in their myths it is almost always tragic. Psyche, a mortal princess, was so beautiful that people stopped worshipping Aphrodite, the goddess. Furious sent Eros to make her fall in love with a monster. Buteros fell in love with her himself. He visited her at night in darkness, never revealing his face. She was forbidden to look, of course. She did. He fled. She wandered the earth performing impossible tasks to win him back. Eventually they were reunited. She was made immortal. One of the rare happy endings, but only after a great deal of divine humiliation, grief, and symbolic death. So why, one might ask, did the Greeks keep telling these stories? Because love out of them was never safe, but it was always real. It was the crack in Thermor, the madness in the king, the pull between mortal and divine. They feared it, revered it, wrapped it in myth so they might understand it, or at least contain it. And perhaps that's why love remains so compelling in their stories. Not because it leads to joy, but because it leads somewhere, downward, inward, forward, into ruin, into glory, into madness. For the mortal caught in the grip of love, there was no map, no safe path, only the hope that the gods would look away just this once. But they rarely did, because for them love was a tool, a game, and for mortals, it was a trap. You'd think after everything Theseus, the monsters, the heartbreak, and the gods with personal vendettas, that mortals in Greek mythology might be rewarded with something a little general after death, a nice rest, a Sunderport meadow perhaps, a reunion with loved ones, and a bit of heart music in the background. But no, because in Greek mythology, death wasn't the end of suffering. It was the beginning of something far more bureaucratic. The afterlife was not heaven. It was mostly gray, and if you were a mortal, even a decent one, Thebist, you could usually hope for after dying was to become a mildly confused shade, wandering aimlessly across a dull plane for eternity without sunlight, identity, or purpose. Welcome to the Meadows. This was the Greek default. Not a place of torture, not exactly, but neither was it comforting. It was bland, unchanging. A sort of cosmic waiting room where the dead drifted about like leaves in a windless forest, remembering less and less. As the centuries rolled by, you weren't punished. You simply were. And if that sounds bleak, well, it was. But let's back up a little. Let's talk logistics. When a person died, their soul, the psyche, separated from the body and made its way to the underworld, guided by Hermes, who handled, among other things, the delivery of souls. One imagines him like a sort of mythological courier, stylish and swift, if perhaps a bit impersonal. The soul would arrive at the banks of the river Styx where Charon, Thegrim-faced ferryman, awaited with his boat. Payment was expected, usually a noble, a coin placed under the tongue, or on the eyes of the deceased at burial. Those without proper burial or without the coin were doomed to wander the shore for 100 years, voiceless and unable to cross. A chilling thought, really. The Genator, the afterlife, could be delayed simply by a careless undertaker. Once fired across the river, assuming everything went smoothly, the soul wouldn't tear the realm of Hades. Not the god himself, though he was there too in a distant shadowy palace, but the place, the underworld, guarded by hubris, the three-headed hound who let you in, but most certainly not out, and here your fate was decided. But not by gods, not usually. The Greek afterlife had a staff, 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Okus, mortals once, and but now the eternal arbiters of the dead. They examined your deeds, your crimes, your sacrifices, and based on this celestial audit, you were sorted. If you are truly vile, a betrayer, a murderer, a blasphemer of extraordinary talent, you might be sent to Tartarus, not just a deep pit, but the pit, a vast abyss of torment located even below Hades itself. Here the worst offenders endured punishments designed not just for pain but for poetic symmetry. Tantalus, who murdered his own son and served him to the gods, was made to stand forever in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree. Whenever he reached set for the fruit or bent to drink, they slipped just out of reach. He was forever hungry, forever thirsty, forever tantalized. CspHus, who cheated death twice, once by tricking Thanos, the spirit of death, and once by convincing his wife not to bury him, was condemned to roll a boulder uphill for all eternity. Each time it neared the summit, it rolled back down. The punishment wasn't just hard labor. It was the futility of effort, the endless repetition of hope undone. Then there was Ixion. He treed hosts, seduced higher, not a wise move. Zeus bound him to a flaming wheel that spins without end, an eternal reminder that some mortal ambitions were simply not worth the risk. But here's the thing, these were rare fates. Tartarus was not overcrowded. Most souls were not evil enough for torment, nor good enough for reward. Which brings us back to the Asphodel Meadows, the realm of the ordinary dead. The decent, the forgettable, the ones who paid their taxes, said their prayers, and didn't cause too much trouble. They simply drifted. And as the centuries passed, they forgot who they were. Forgotten by the living, unremarkable among the dead, they faded, not erased. The Greeks didn't believe in annihilation but reduced, diminished, present, but without sharpness. It wasn't punishment, it was entropy, but not all souls ended there. A fortunate few heroes, the exceptionally just, or those favored by the gods, were granted entry into the Elysian fields. Now this finally was something approaching reward. A land of endless spring, gentle breezes, music, feasts, athletic contests if you fancied a bit of running after death. The elite of the afterlife. Achilles was there, though in home, he wasn't exactly thrilled about it. When Odysseus visits the underworld and speaks to Achilles, the great warrior says he would rather be a living servant to a poor man than a king among the dead, which rather dampens the appeal. Still, the Elysian fields offered peace, if not pleasure. And if you lived particularly well or were reincarnated and lived well again, you might be allowed to stay there forever. A sort of celestial retirement inn for the morally consistent. The Greeks did in time entertain the idea of reincarnation. Plato, ever the philosopher, wrote of souls being judged, then choosing their next life based on the lessons learned. A philosopher might become a king, a tyrant perhaps, a dung beetle. Your fate in this telling was shaped by what you valued. Wisdom led to clarity, vanity led to repetition. It was not universal belief, more a philosophical add-on, but it showed that even the Greeks longed for some sense of justice beyond the grave. Still, foremost, the underworld remained what it always had been, a place of silence. There was no divine light, no reward for faith. The gods of Olympus lived forever, but mortals, even beloved mortals, sank into shadow. Even the heroes who visited the underworld, Odysseus, Aeneas, Orpheus, came away changed, haunted. It was not a place you left without consequence. And mortals who tried to cheat death, well, they rarely succeeded. Orpheus, as we've seen, looked back to Persephone, stolen by Hades, ate 6 seeds of a pomegranate and was bound to return each year. Even Heracles, who went to fetch Cerberus as one of his labors, barely escaped unscathed. Death in Greek thought was not evil. It was inevitable, unavoidable. It did not judge or weep or rage. It simply came. Then the spirit of death was not cruel. He was quiet, pale, winged. He did not chase, he arrived, and when he did, your story ended. Or rather, it continued just without plot. The funeral rituals reflected this view. The Greeks took burial seriously. It wasn't about grief alone, it was necessity. To be unburied was to be trapped, restless, cut off. Even enemies were sometimes buried by their foes, simply to ensure their souls wouldn't linger. And libations, offerings poured into the earth, were common. Wine, milk, honey, olive oil, not because the dead could drink them, but because it kept the bond intact. The living honored the dead, and in doing so reminded themselves that their own journey would someday lead below. So they prayed, sacrificed, built tombs, whispered names, not out of fear precisely, but out of duty. Because afterlife, though quiet, was not entirely empty, and memory in the Greek imagination was the only thing that could truly outlive death. If no one remembered you, you faded. If they did, if they told your stories, visited your grave, spoke your name, you lingered, dimly, softly, but still. And so, Thegratosphere was not fire or punishment. It was being forgotten. That's why heroes chased glory, why poets wrote epics, why names were carved into stone. Because even if the gods signered you, even if fate consumed you, perhaps someone somewhere would remember, and in that memory you would remain just a little longer. Imagine, if you will, living every moment of your life with the unsettling feeling that someone is watching you, not just someone, dozens of someones from the sky, the sea, the forest, the hearth, the shadows. Some are interested in your offerings. Some are interested in your mistakes. And all of them have opinions. That was the world of a mortal in ancient Greece. The gods weren't distant. They didn't reside in some heavenly realm beyond the clouds emerging only for cosmic events. No, they were everywhere in every flame, breeze, groan of timber, rustle of oil. They were always watching. And more troubling still, they were judging that noticed everything. What you offered, what you said, what you didn't say, whether you were clean, whether you were honest, whether you looked the wrong direction during a festival or sneezed at the wrong moment in a temple. They watched you because you mattered, and also because you didn't. The gods, after all, had a tendency to fixate on mortals the way children fixate on ants, fascinated, occasionally kind, often cruel. Even if you weren't a hero or a villain, even if you were just a simple fisherman or potter or widow selling figs at the market, you still lived under their gaze, and that meant you were always one earnest prayer away from misfortune. Take Action, a perfectly decent young man, a hunter, a man fond of dogs and the quiet of woods. One day, while wandering in the forest, he happened to stumble upon a glade. A soft breeze moved through the trees. Birds chirped, and there, bathing in a secluded pool, was Artemis, goddess of the hunt, the moon, and fierce leagueward chastity. He did not speak, he did not stare, he simply saw her. That was enough. She turned, her eyes met his, and without a word she transformed him into a stag. His own dogs, loyal, sharp-toothed, and now very confused, tore him to pieces. The message was clear. Innocence was not a defense. The gods were watching and they did not take kindly to being seen. Then there's the story of Boses and Phelan, a rare happy tale, but one with a sharp edge. Zeus and Hermes, disguised as poor travelers, wandered from door to door in a village, seeking shelter. House after house turned them away. Some mocked them, some slammed the door. Only one cottage opened, a humble home shared by an elderly couple. They had little, but they gave freely: bread, olives, wine, and kindness. And so the gods, having revealed themselves, rewarded them. They turned the rude neighbors' homes to ash, flooded the village. Bays and Philemon were spared. Their cottage transformed into a temple. They were made priests, and when they died, they became two trees intertwined forever. It's a sweet story, but behind the blessing is a darker truth. The gods were testing you secretly, constantly, and you never knew when it might be a beggar at your table, a stranger at the crossroads, a coin dropped on the road. Pass the test, and you might be honored. Fail, and you might be turned into a tree or a statue or There was no formal notice, no warning sign, no heavenly voice saying, "This is a test." You simply had to assume that the gods were watching and that they were not easily impressed. Hospitality xenia, as it was known, was a card. To mistreat a guest was to insult Zeus himself, who was said to protect strangers and wanderers, but the same went for offerings, for sacrifices, for public festivals. Everything had to be done properly. The right words, the right steps, the right incense, and if it wasn't, well, perhaps the crops would fail, perhaps your ship would sink, perhaps your firstborn would cow once, then never again. There was no divine memo, no official notification that you'd offended a god. You had to piece it together. Was it Hera? Was it Apollo? Was it because you pulled the wine with your left hand? There's a kind of divina paranoia embedded in ancient Greek life. Not neurotic fear exactly, but a constant awareness that every action that had meaning and every oversight might carry consequences. And with so many gods, Olympians, titans, river gods, tree spirits, household deities, nymphs of spring and stream, the chances of accidentally offending one were frankly rather high. Even saying a god's name in the wrong context could cause trouble. The poet Hyatt warned of speaking ill of the gods after dark. Night was sacred. Silence was better, safer. And yet, silence too could be dangerous. Because what if the gods expected thanks or tribute or song? And so mortals lived in a kind of delicate balancing act. Speaking just enough, offering just enough, fearing just enough. Too much reverence and you might seem insincere. Too little and you'd seem ungrateful. It was a kind of cosmic etiquette, and the gods, like all finicky dynagists, paid very close attention to manners. Then there were the temples, grand, beautiful spaces of marble and gold and flickering flame, but also homes, the gods' homes, and like any guest, you had to behave. Yahweh had to wash, to dress properly, to bring gifts, and above all to mean it, because the gods weren't just watching your actions, they were watching your heart. Piety was not a checklist. It was a posture of being, and mortals were expected to hold that posture forever. Even the festivals which could be joyful was serious business. The Dionia, for example, with its theater and wine and revelry, wasn't just a party, it was a religious act. If you laughed too much at the wrong play or didn't laugh at all, it could be seen as an insult. Your enjoyment, your laughter, your participation, all part of the offering. Even at weddings and funerals, the gods were present, watching, judging. Did the bride offer properly to her? Was her missionary for guiding the dead? Were the laments sung loudly enough? Did the family remember to purify the house afterwards? Every detail mattered because in Greek mythology, the gods did not need your affection, but they demanded your, and they were always ready to correct you. Sometimes the judgment came quietly, a sudden illness, a failed harvest, a fishless season. Other times it came dramatically, a storm at sea, a madness in the family, a voice in the night, and once in a while it came with lightning because Zeus did love a good thunderbolt. Even historians of the time like Herodotus recorded events with divine judgment in mind. A king fell. Clearly he offended the gods. A city burned. Someone must have grown too proud. There was always a moral to the misfortune. Always a finger pointing skyward. And so people told stories, remembered missteps, warned children, left small offerings on window sills, whispered apologies to trees, sprinkled libations into the earth just in case. Because when the gods were angry they might destroy you. But when they were merely curious, that could be worse. Curiosity led to tests, to games, to strange dreams and strangerments, to impossible choices with no right answer. And still mortals played along. They told their myths, built their temples, painted their pots with stories of judgment and justice and divine caprice, not because they loved their gods, but because they understood them. The gods were like storms, beautiful, unpredictable, necessary. And so long as you honored them, or at least tried to, perhaps they'd pass over your house without striking. Perhaps. But there were no guarantees, because the gods were watching and they were always judging. There is a unique kind of cruelty in knowing your fate and being utterly powerless to change it. That, in essence, was the Greek prophecy, not a warning to be avoided, not a guide to be followed, but a sentence spoken aloud. In mythology, prophecies weren't meant to help you, they were meant to trap you. They didn't just tell the future, they ensured it would happen. Even the act of trying to escape a prophecy was more often than not the thievery thing that fulfilled it. For mortals, this was particularly agonizing because the gods might tell you what was coming, but they would never under any circumstance explain how to survive it. Take for example the most famous case of all, Oedipus, a prince born in Thebes. A child prophesied to kill his father and marry his mother. His parents, understandably horrified, tried to kill him. A standard reaction in mythology. They pierced his ankles, tied him up, and left him on a mountain to die. But fate is rather good at navigating mountains. A shepherd found him, far away in Corinth, unaware of his true origins, and one day, when Oedipus himself heard the prophecy, he did what seemed logical. He ran, fled Corinth, determined never to return so he might avoid killing his father. On the road, he quarreled with a stranger, the kind of heated, masculine misunderstanding expects at a crossroads. He killed a man. Later he arrived in Thebes, saved the city from the Sphinx, married the queen, and slowly, terribly, the truth emerged. The man he'd killed, his real father, the queen, his mother, the prophecy had come true. Not because he ignored it, but because he tried to stop it. That, you see, is how Greek prophecy works. It does not lie, but it never helps. It tells you what, never how, and certainly never why. Even heroes were not exempt. Take Perseus. The prophecy said he would kill his grandfather. Acrys. So Arcreus naturally locked his daughter Dia in a bronze chamber to prevent her from ever having children. Zeus, always up for a challenge, entered the chamber anyway, as a shower of gold. Mythology is full of these sorts of unorthodox relationships. Perseus was born, sent away, grew up, became a hero. Years later, at some friendly games, he threw a discus. A stray wind, a bad bounce. The discus flew into the crowd and struck his grandfather dead. Prophecy fulfilled. No malice, no design, just fate doing what fate does. Then there's Cryas, the famously wealthy king of Lydia. Before waging war against Persians, he consulted the oracle at Delphi as one did. The oracle told him, if you cross the river, a great empire will fall. Cryas, confident, charged into battle, and he lost. The empire that fell was his own. The message was accurate, just not in the way he'd hoped. The Greeks understood this paradox. They didn't see fate as a riddle to be solved, but as a thread to be followed, whether you liked it or not. The Moira, the Fates, were three ancient goddesses who governed every mortal's life. Cloth spun the thread, Lysis measured it, Atropos cut it. Even the gods respected them, even Zeus, because fate was older than Olympus, older than time. And Theoricals, those haunted priestesses who spoke the will of Apollo, were not inventing their words, they were translating. The most famous oracle, of course, was the Pythia at Delhi. She sat on a tripod over a chasm in the temple floor, inhaling vapors probably from naturally occurring gases, and spoke in riddles. Kings consulted her before wars, generals before campaigns, farmers before planting, and she wouldn't were, but always vaguely, always with just enough ambiguity to keep things interesting. Ask how long you'll live, and she might say, when the eagle leaves its nest, so too shall your flame go out. Ask if your son will return from battle, and she might reply, he will bring glory to your name, though not yours. Technically true, practically useless. It wasn't that the gods enjoyed confusing mortals. Well, actually they did enjoy it. A little, but prophecy for them was more like theater, a carefully written script where mortals played their roles. And no one, not even the protagonist, could skip a line. This made life rather tense for those who were prophesied about. Take Paris of Troy at his birth. A prophecy warned he would bring about the destruction of his city, so he was abandoned on a hillside, a recovering thome. But of course he survived. Grew up, became handsome, charming, rather fond of judging divine beauty contests. One golden apple, one seduction of Helen, one 10-year war later prophesied Troy burned. All because a baby was fated to cause ruin and because mortals in trying to prevent it made it inevitable. It's tempting to think of prophecy as a trap, but the Greeks didn't quite see it that way. They saw it as Moira, your portion, your lot, something not to be escaped, but to boy. In fact, the truly tragic characters weren't the ones who tried to defy fate. They were the ones who never learned what it was. Take Agamemnon. He returned home from Troy, victorious, proud, utterly unaware that his wife, Clytemnestra, planned to murder him in his bath. There was no prophecy warning him, no divine whisper, just the slow mark of consequences for a war he started. A daughter he sacrificed, a kingdom he neglected. In a way, the silence was worse than the omen. At least when the gods speak, you know what's coming. But prophecy wasn't just a tool of tragedy. Sometimes it was a mechanism for power. Kings claimed divine approval through oracles. Founders of colonies sought signs. Even Socrates, the philosopher, was famously told by the oracle at Delhi that no man was wiser than he. He spent the rest of his life trying to prove it wrong, and in doing so proved it right. That was the great irony of Greek prophecy. It revealed truth, not by clarifying but by challenging. You understood it only after it happened. Only after the bodies were counted, the temples burned, the throne vacant. Only then did someone somewhere say, "Ah, so that's what it meant." And so mortals learned to live with uncertainty. They consulted oracles. Yes, but they also built contingency plans. They made sacrifices, read omens in bird flight, burned bones, and studied the cracks. A priestess might interpret the bleeding of a goat. A general might base a military decision in the way a chicken pecked a grain. If that sounds ridiculous, remember they weren't looking for certainty. They were looking for alignment, a sense that their actions fit the will of fate. Because if the gods approved or seemed to, perhaps things would go well. And if they didn't, at least the disaster would be dignified. Even mythology's cleverest mortals, Odysseus, for instance, never outwitted prophecy. They navigated it, delayed it, danced around its edges. But the thread was always waiting to be cut, and no one, not even theatricsters, escaped in the end. There is something terribly human in this to long for knowledge, to receive it in part, and to realize that knowledge alone does not grant control, to know that the future is written and still to hope that maybe, just maybe, it isn't written in ink. Some mortals went mad from prophecy. Cassandra, of course, saw everything and could change nothing. Others, like Laius and Jocasta, acted decisively, boldly, and made things worse. And a few simply walked forward like Achilles. He knew his fate, knew he would die young, knew his name would live on while his life would be cut short, and he chose it. That's the strange mercy of prophecy. It tells you the end, but it never tells you what kind of person you'll be when you meet it. And so, in the space between the knowing and the arriving, mortals lived, loved, fought, failed, sang, died, and somewhere far above or deep within, the gods watched and smiled, because prophecy, after all, was not just a sentence. It was a story. And mortals, they played their parts beautifully. If you were a mortal in ancient Greece, you likely accepted a few basic truths. The gods were powerful, fate was inevitable, monsters existed, and somewhere somehow the end of the world was coming, or at least the end of your world. Because in Greek mythology, when things went wrong, truly wrong, it was never the gods who paid the price, it was the mortals. They suffered first and they suffered most. You could be a farmer planting barley, or a sailor watching the coast fade, or a mother brushing olive oil onto her child's hair, and without warning the gods could decide that your city, your field, your life was finished, not from malice necessarily. Sometimes from boredom, sometimes as a warning to others, sometimes as the side effect of a squabble between toy about who forgot the libation last festival. The reasons didn't matter, the consequences always did. Let's begin then with the flood. Not Noah's but Deucalion's, the Greek version. You see, once upon a time, humans had come in Zeus's eyes, a bit unruly, loud, ungrateful. Too many festivals gone unobserved, too many sacrifices skimped. The gods had given them fire, taught them farming, let them name the stars, and how did they repay it? By being irritating. So Zeus rather characteristically lied to wipe them out. He unleashed a great flood, a deluge that covered the earth. Temples sank, herds drowned, cities vanished beneath the waves. Unlike war, mortals survived. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, not because they were particularly strong or cunning or rich, but because they were pious. Zeus gave them a warning. They built a chest, not a grand ship, just a watertight box. They floated as the world drowned, and when the waters rest, they stepped onto a barren, empty world, alone, alive, exhausted. To repopulate the earth, they were told to throw the bones of their mother behind them. A riddle, naturally. They realized this meant the stones of Gaia, the earth. As they threw the stones, they transformed into people, the new human race, stone-born, hardy, no longer made of gold or silver or bronze, as earlier mythic races had been, but of rock, tough, durable, slightly miserable. The flood myth wasn't unique to Greece, but its moral was telling. When the world ends, the gods start over, but the mortals, they have to rebuild, from nothing with no help. Then there's tale of Pandora. Pandora, the first woman crafted by Hystus, blessed by the gods with beauty, grace, and curiosity, and gifted a jar, or, as it's more famously mistranslated, a box. She was told not to open it. Naturalish did, and from it poured every sorrow known to humankind. Disease, famine, war, grief, madness, aging, all the things the golden race had never known. Hope flooded out last, whether as comfort or cruel joke, depends on how you read it. But the point is clear. The gods gave mortals the tools of suffering, sometimes directly, sometimes wrapped in something lovely, Pandora wasn't evil. She wasn't even malicious. She was simply human. And the punishment, as always, fell on everyone. Even Prometheus, who loved mortals and gave them fire, was punished, chained to a rock, liver devoured daily by an eagle, not because he had destroyed anything, but because he had helped. Helping mortals, it seemed, was a Sisyphus offense, and yet mortals kept living, kept working, worshipping, hoping, perhaps because hope had slipped out of the jar, too. But the gods didn't need an apocalypse to end a world. Sometimes they simply turned away. Dieta, for instance, when her daughter Pisphania was taken by Hades into the underworld. Dieta, goddess of the harvest, wandereth earth in mourning. Crops failed, famine spread, the green world turned brown. Mortals starved, not because they sinned, but because Amitha grieved. Eventually, a compromise was struck. Pisphania would spend part of the year above, part below. And so came the seasons. Spring and summer when the daughter returns. Autumn and winter when she descends. It's a beautiful myth, but one built on the bones of the hungry. Even in their sadness, the gods had consequences. Then there were wars. The Trojan War wasn't just a clash of men and swords. It was divine theater. Aphrodite gave Helen to Paris. Hea and Athena snubbed, supported the Greeks. Zeus watched, occasionally amused, occasionally bored, and as the gods chose sides, mortals did. Achilles, Hector, Patroclus, Ajax, thousands unnamed. A city fell, a king lost his homecoming, a queen plotted her revenge. And why? Because a mortal judged a divine beauty contest. One poor choice, one golden apple, one complimentist to the wrong immortal, and the world burned. The gods in their way were always reenacting creation and destruction. Every war was a mini-apocalypse, every slight a chance to unravel everything. Mortals weren't consulted. They were simply caught in the blast radius. Even love could end the world. Asked Samael. She was a mortal woman seduced by Zeus. Hera, jealous, tricked her into asking Zeus to reveal his true form. He did. She was vaporized by divine radiance. Her unborn child Dionysus was saved. Sian into Zeus's thigh. A rarely tidy Semmel's death wasn't malicious. It was technical. She wasn't built to see a god bear his power. Mortals never are. Then there's madness. The gods could break a mortal mind as easily as snapping a reed. Take Heracles, the greatest hero, strongest of men. Driven mad by her, he slaughtered his wife and children. The world ended in that moment, for him. And though he atoned, though he performed 12 impossible labors and was eventually made a god himself, the cost wasn't bearable for the mortals in his story. There was no redemption arc, only blood, only violence. The Greek worldview was not without hope, but it was shaped by resignation. Mortals lived in a world that was not built for them. They lived on borrowed land, under borrowed sky, at the mercy of bungs, who did not always know or care what their actions cost. And when the gods lost interest, well then things got truly dangerous. A neglected ritual, a missed omen, a slighted shrine, any of these could lead to plagues, storms, madness, crop failure. The gods didn't need to rage, they simply had to stop listening. The end of a mortal world wasn't a fiery conclusion, it was silence from Olympus. And still they prayed to Athena for wisdom, to Apollo for healing, to Artemis for safety in childbirth. They sang the hymns, burned the fat, poured the wine, not because Athena were certain it would help, but because they feed what happened when no one did. Mortals learned to live with small ones, personal ones, city walls collapsing, loved ones turning to shadows, heroes vanishing into smoke. They accepted that time was not kind, that history was not fair, that the gods had other priorities. But they told their stories, myths, painted the jars, built the temples, because telling the story in the end was all the power they had to name this bearing, to place it in context, to turn the chaos into something resembling sense. So when the world ended, as it often did in pieces, at least it could be remembered, sung, shared. Even the end, the Greeks knew, could be made beautiful, if only in hindsight. And that perhaps was the only comfort a mortal could rely on. The gods would do what they pleased, but the mortals, they would make meaning of it. They would gather the ashes and write it down. Once upon a time, though, as with all Greek myths, once is more a suggestion than a precise timestamp, there lived a man named Orpheus.